Welcome to the Crash Chords podcast, Dave. I can't let you do that, Dave. Or Steve.
Creepy. Downright creepy.
Yeah, and probably really low, too.
It's not that low.
Really
it's
low.
more like, I can't let you do that, Dave.
Well, you can do magic, like making parts louder than other parts, right?
I can do...
It's okay.
Isn't
No,
that
it is magic because it is well outside the realm of what Matt knows how to do things.
That's not true. If
And any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic.
Can you repeat everything you just said?
No, I couldn't.
Good. Good.
Why would you ask? Before we get into the meat of this episode, or the fish, as it were. Wah, wah.
Oh. I couldn't have even...
Collective sigh.
I couldn't have even. That's to say something.
Yeah, I know, that's impressive, right?
Yeah.
I was in not one, but 2 music videos this weekend. Same day, actually, both on Sunday. This past weekend, I was a part of Afterbirth Monkey's music video shoot for...
Oh, The Weekend.
The Weekend.
Oh, The Weekend.
The Weekend.
He did it on The Weekend.
The Weekend.
I love it.
Shoot for...
It's Raining Dicks. Featuring Schaefer the Dark Lord.
I love the contrast there.
And
we shooted It's Raining Dicks on The Weekend.
I'll leave most of what I actually shot for either the article or when the video comes out. The video, however, I have recently learned on the internet today, will be coming out on July 27th. So, very soon. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. We'll probably feature it to some capacity on the website, because we try to do that for the artists we know and love. But it was a lot of fun. I had a blast. There were some other people there that I'd met through the burlesque community who are friends with Charles Stunning, who were there to be part of the Boner Zombie Horde. I am not kidding.
What was the other video you did?
The other video was for Eli August and the Abandoned Buildings. EAAB, as I realized they've been using the acronym recently.
Yab?
Yab. Yab.
Eebe.
You're still mispronouncing that.
Yeah.
Either Eeb or Eebe.
Evie?
Eeb. Or Eebe.
I really want clips of that in the bloopers at the end of this year. Just you doing that over and over again.
It's a nice little throat movement there.
It was for the first single off their new EP that comes out soon called Slow Start. Interesting fact, when you do a performance setup for a music video, so band performing and getting crowd shots,
Uh-huh.
you have to do the same song over and over again a lot.
Yeah.
No.
The fun thing, though,
That's
was...
what's involved with making things meticulously.
The fun thing, though, was... so it was a video shoot and live performance. So Matt DeBlas, who is a mandolin player within Eli August, played a solo set. Painless Parker played a solo set and then actually invited a few of the Wasties on stage with him to play. Then Eli August... We did the video shoot with them where they played the song over and over again. Mm-hmm. Then Eli August did a full set. They closed the full set with Slow Start. So everyone was able to sing along when they were playing it live instead of to playback, which was kind of fun. And then the Wasties closed out the night with 4 strong songs before we all went home and went to sleep. So it was a fun night of music and live performancing and dancing and...
Debauchery.
How exhausting for you.
Was it debauchery?
To have all that fun, jeez.
Actually, what was exhausting was having to dance as intense for 4 or 5 different angles, because they were doing it in front of the crowd, behind the crowd, so you pretty much had to react the same way, so the shots would sync up.
To get it from different angles, again, and again, and again.
Why can't they just buy like 30 or 40 recorders?
Well, they hired a director who brought cameras, and I guess they didn't have 30 or 40 cameras.
You know,
That is a director.
well, what's the
who
quality
needs
of
more.
camera? That's the big question.
Really nice cameras. I don't remember what they were
Yeah, that
off
thing
the top
is
of my head.
Did they
not
have
a dime a dozen.
They were on dollies, and yeah,
They were on
they had a
train-
GoPro also for stage shots, but it was mostly the dolly cameras.
They were on train tracks.
No, they were just on the
I
tripod
was hoping
dollies.
there was going to be crossover for Steve there.
What?
Train tracks.
Cameras and train
That
tracks.
was shallow.
Not shallow.
What
I was
is it about
reaching.
me and
I was
trains?
rising.
Just because I like trains.
But yeah, so that video shoot was a lot of fun also. And Eli August actually gave us a shout out recently on his Twitter feed promoting the podcast, which was really nice of him.
So thank you.
But yeah, it was kind of cool to be a part of 2 different music videos as a extra, essentially. I was featured a little more in the Afterbirth Monkey, but that's because I'm such good friends with Charles. So any fun, interesting shots you could stick me in, I was in.
Oh,
Because
by
of-
the way, throwback to a few weeks ago. John, you mentioned you were in a music video.
Yes, I was.
Can't
in
find it.
I believe
Listen back. Listen to the name. Can't find it.
Suicide Machine. It was for a Rob Zombie movie. I couldn't tell you which one.
So it was for a movie.
It was
That
for a
might be why I
movie, one of
can't
those things. I was a little dude in the middle of a big crowd. Like hundreds of people sprayed with fake blood lying on the ground.
I'll get it right this time.
Yeah.
I'm gonna find it.
No, you'll never find me.
I've been in a music video already. Besides these two,
this weekend.
Well,
yes,
no.
yes.
Shape of the Dark Lord's video for girls featuring Christy B. The last shot of the they peppered in some live shots from the show that I wrote about. The last shot of the live show pans the camera over the crowd, and you see a tall, doofy guy in a hat. That was me.
And you were the guy behind him.
So yeah, but that was kind of a blast, and I'm hoping that Afterbirth Monkey does some videos for the new album. Speaking of which, I can't say this on air, but she told me the title of the album, so we'll talk about that later, although I have to remember it now. But she told me the title of the new album.
I never thought I'd actually see...
You into withholding lately.
See Steve get jealous, because it seems like he's super jealous, because he's never been in a music video.
No, I really don't care. But
He could have been in either of these.
oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about those 50 music videos that I was in. But yeah,
he
they're nothing.
makes music.
They're nothing really.
But he had never been in video.
That's the mark of a true musician. We are the man behind the curtain, so to speak.
That's baloney.
Never in the limelight.
That's baloney.
Always.
Shut up.
I totally can't downplay that anymore.
Name one person that has never been in the limelight.
That's a musician. That's not.
Well, okay, no,
classically
it's more of
trained.
a composer thing. Like for instance, John Williams is. Even though yes, we all know the name John Williams,
He's still failing.
No, seriously, he does not want to be like in the limelight. He doesn't want to be that guy doing 1,000 interviews. He had like one really, really big interview recently with Brian Williams, where he actually played the NBC theme, which he wrote. But that's like the first interview he's done in years. So not a limelight guy.
But here's the whole thing.
Composers are background people.
But here's the whole thing. If you can name one, obviously they're not background people because they would have been forgotten about. So by the very fact that you can name them...
Oh, well, I know several, but you wouldn't know them.
Thank you, Hipster Steve.
So yeah. So that was that.
Can we move on to real content now?
Oh yeah. Oh, I was gonna. Well, I'll promote it anyway. If you're listening to this on the day it came out, quickly run to the Way Station because the Wasties are playing at 10 p.m. Awesome. Okay, let's move on.
Jeez. Your
right.
expectations, man.
Well, whatever. Maybe people listen
What?
to it as soon as it comes out. It's possible.
My dad listens to it as soon as it comes out.
Does he really?
Well, that's
I
the
want
only
just
time he
one
ever-
person out
he ever
there
gets-
to do that, to do what Matt said, because Matt, I will admire your tenacity and shout you out next
That
week.
would be great. Yeah, come up to me at the show and let me know.
Running with their iPod, listening to our podcast on the way.
Come up to the show, find Matt, poke him in the nose, and we'll give you a shout out.
I think we just
This
found our
week-
200th episode special spectacular.
This week, we are reviewing... Wow, it just cracked right there. We are reviewing Phish. And their newest album, their 12th studio LP, Fuego. Phish is a band that's been around for over 3 decades now.
86, I believe, was their first...
83
Oh.
was their original. 86 was when they
Yeah.
finalized...
That was their first studio album, I believe.
Yes, and it's when they finalized who the actual band members were going to be. And most of those gentlemen have stayed with that group for the time being. Phish is an interesting combination of... Well, at its core, it's jam rock with a heavy influence of jazz, of funk, bluegrass, blues, psychedelic, progressive, a little bit of everything.
All the stuff that's fun to jam to.
Essentially anything that was created in the time frame they've been making music.
Indeed.
They even introduced...
Well, no, even beforehand, really.
Yes.
I detect a huge 60s, 70s influence in their sound. They always have this little twang about them, granted not in every track, where they seem to want to live on off Woodstock forever.
Yeah, I would say that. Even though in this album that we're about to review, there is a dashing of a little more modern tones with the experimentation with some of the electronica elements here and there, a little bit of warp, a little bit of beating.
And to their credit, they are really, really flexible. I mean, they slip in and out of genres almost seamlessly.
And the big thing you need to know about Phish, if you don't know Phish, is that if you don't know Phish, you don't know Phish. They are one of the biggest underground bands in existence.
Not anymore.
No, even nowadays, they get no loving on most radio stations. And this is where we have a radio station for everything.
I guess that's fair, but that might be one of those cases where when something's... I mean, if something's been underground for so long and known as something underground, I just don't think you're underground anymore.
Phish fans are why they're not 100% underground. Because Phish has sold over 8 million records at last count. They have a huge following with 12 LPs.
Sure, they had a couple that went platinum, a couple that went gold.
Yeah, and they've got... Counting their live albums, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40, 50 actual records.
Yeah, so I just can't say, underground at that stage. I will...
But you'll never hear mainstream media say the word Phish. Even when somebody like Rolling Stones talks about them.
Yeah,
but
that's really going to get into the meat of what we're talking about here. You will not hear mainstream media discuss a jam band. And that's, I think, the real thing. It's not so much Phish, it's the fact that they... jam so much. It's the fact that their songs aren't as easy to market as singles.
There's a jam band that mainstream media would talk about, though.
Who's that?
Dave Matthews Band. They are a jam band.
Well, no. Dave Matthews Band is one of those things that's like in... There's big dividers about the Dave Matthews Band. So,
I don't really consider them a jam band.
Yeah, so... And personally, I'm a fan of Dave Matthews Band. I really am. But you will meet a lot of contention when you discuss them, so I can't give that the sweeping okay for mainstream media.
Grateful Dead. If you want to talk about a jam band,
that's only even that's only from a historical perspective.
Yeah, because that only really happened after he passed away.
Yeah, in fact, right now the continuation of the Grateful Dead is the Rat Dog, the spin-off, if you will. They, I think, are actually underground. So even, when you perpetuate the Grateful Dead into present-day culture, yeah, they're still underground in a way.
So, the album.
Fuego.
First, a little bit about what they do. Obviously, it goes without saying, now that we've mentioned jam bands so much, the jamming involves a lot of improvisation. And I am almost inclined to believe that people go to Phish more for their live work than for their studio work. And that's going to be a bit of a segue into this album. But first, this is just from my experience of from knowing Phish fans personally, is that they put so much emphasis on, man, you got to listen to Hampton, Virginia, 99. That's where it's at, man. You just got to zone out. And that's an interesting thing.
Same experience I've had with Phish fans. Because while I've had a love-hate relationship with them, I've never been one to commit to albums with them.
And it's it's also tough to commit to a live album, only because maybe there's less emotional connection there. Because unless you were at the show, and that's a whole different thing entirely, if you were at the show, instant emotional connection, and you feel like if there is a release of that live performance, then it's going to be personal to you for life, if you were a fan. But less so for the people that weren't there. You have to put more... There's more investment there, I think, than there is for a studio album.
I don't believe that 100%. I'll believe that me personally being at a show versus me listening to that same show on the record, there's more connection in the moment live there. But there are live albums that I've connected to quite tightly, and that the emotional connection is there very strong.
Despite whether you have been to the concert or
not. A Little South of Sanity by Aerosmith is one of their most potent emotional records, because they're hitting those songs harder, because they're pushing themselves harder, they're changing it up a little bit, they're throwing some live stuff.
Sure. There's a lot of 60s and 70s music that I prefer over the recorded.
So I understand what you're saying, I just don't know that I'd make the sweeping statement.
No, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, it's more about just looking at Phish, because of the fact that people look so much toward the live work. It does change in some way the way you think about their studio work, which is really how we think about every other band and their product. Because this is kind of a rare thing for us, and in some ways almost a little bit contrary to what we do here, because we focus so much on the end result as opposed to the process, the journey, which I think is more the mark of a successful improvisatory release. Not so much what it did, but what it was doing, if you follow. But of course, they were not doing a live album today. Fuego is a studio album, and studio work does give even the most stage-minded musicians a chance to further refine what can't always be achieved on stage. Although, I do detect very little distinction between those two cases, between studio and and live with respect to Phish's work, just because that I associate them so much with the live sound that it breaches over back and forth easily. Anyway, a little bit more on that later. But what you do need to understand going in is that since improv is their forte, much of the work here will reflect that emphasis on process, flow, and linear inspiration. That's what we're looking at.
So the first track is the title track,
Fuego,
which we get right into the nitty-gritty of.
It is a track in 3 parts.
Okay, so first let's just... there are blurred lines with the parts. But the first thing we can say for to start is the intro is very unique and engaging in the immediate moments.
I actually have a little bit of contention with that right up front. Not so much, it's sweeping, but I have some particulars to make about this intro because it's going to relate to my feelings about this track and to some extent the record. So it begins with a very open, somewhat tense augmented chord. Almost immediately we're waiting for a resolution, and the bass here is the driving melody, which is always pretty sexy. But the one critique I have right here that almost clashes with what I said about improv right off the bat, whether indeed we're improvising at all, is that this is a case of multiple intros to me, kind of a confusion of personality in a way. Like the augmented chord is almost Broadway, with the bright piano, tasteful build. It's almost like cheap horror. And then you can almost picture a forlorn character walk out to stage to tell you of her woes through song. So for this reason, this could have perhaps stood to carry out that tension for a little bit further, I thought. I will praise that particular transition, though, despite that I may have wanted more tension, because it was somewhat, even though it was a somewhat premature release to the 1 chord, it was a great one. You have that 5 augmented chord to the minor 1. That's a very sorrowful shift. And the bass gave it that extra something, adding a little twang of lost romance, something out of a film noir. That's a decisive choice.
It was graceful in that way, dramatic. It was promoting this idea of heavy drama, yet without becoming really too full of itself.
Exactly.
It had a certain fluidity to it that kept it from becoming that high tension that you're talking about.
Right.
It stayed along the lines of, it can go both ways. It can become an easygoing, or it becomes a quite even fearful piece.
Exactly. That was only the first 16 bars, because then, after that shift, it lost me a little bit on the next shift. It moves up to A with this little unsettling flat 2 in there, and I thought that was a little bit of a character departure. Suddenly, I'm not in this movie anymore, and frankly, I don't have much of a frame of reference yet, at 30 seconds in, to say where I am at all. Because the next shift after that is even more bizarre. Staying on A, we switch the mode up to major, which we now perceive as a distinct modulation, making A major our new 1, and from here on it's just a cheery romp in the park. So I feel like I just watched an abridged film with lost footage.
It wasn't just cheery romp, though. It does go through a little bit of phase work, and it does have
once it goes into the verse, sure.
No, before the verse, it has a distinct off-key kind of a melody being built into it. It's still going at odds. Instead of this tension that you were feeling in the bass and piano of the original part, you were getting it in the expansion of and the inclusion of the other instruments, but presented with just being off tempo.
But see, once we're on A major, I really didn't get that. As of A major, I felt very little tension at all.
No, that's where these
it had gone poof in the night.
No, it was transformed into a different type of tension, presented in a different way.
I personally don't get a lot of tension from major, but...
No, I'm saying, it was those off keys. That's what they were going for there. I saw the idea that they were building still being built, but it was being used in a very dramatically different way. It was, instead of trying to actually do it with the harmonies, they were trying to do it with just the positioning of the chords. Well, this was not to its benefit, though. That's where I got to say when they really undergo that major phase shift away from this noir-y, deep feeling into that more happy-go-lucky.
Right.
But that happy-go-lucky with that little bit of discord, I didn't enjoy that. I liked the parts separate. I like that happy-go-lucky.
No, actually,
I like
no,
that
that's a good point.
discoordinated.
The fact that I like these individual segments would probably work really, really great in their own right if they were part of a whole separate song. But that's why I'm choosing to focus in on this really, really early in this track and this record, because this seems to be indicative of that very same problem that we were talking about. Whether it's a problem for you or not, this may very well be born out of improvisation, because that's the only way I could sort of explain that rapid motion through various sections before settling on an A section, the verse, which is even more disconnected. That's four distinct things.
And
Problem for me.
Actually, but taken individually, they were a lot of fun. There was one
Of course.
There was one part where the lower registered piano is really kind of adhering towards the rhythm, while the higher and the other hand is playing along with the melody. It was the same instrument. It was one piano, but it sounded like two complete different parts being played.
Right.
They had so independent natures to them that it was amazing the way one hand is just playing off of that guitar and the other one's playing off the drums.
Yeah.
Did great to actually bridge the two things, the melody and the rhythm together, without really any distinct harmonies being built into it.
Are you in the verse yet, or still prior?
This is that verse.
This is that verse. Okay, that verse. Yeah, that's It definitely did darken up the mood a bit, and to be honest, this is something a little bit more familiar, something I'm more familiar with the Phish that I do know from prior. You get these little subtle changes in harmony, and the verses. Part of it is sung as a choir, and they are very bizarre, especially lyrically.
They don't depart too much from the normal lyrics here, as what they would do with, your standard fare rock and roll, which, if you go back to the 60s, a lot of their stuff just really does harken back to it. But when they start
almost
repeating,
get kind of a ballad feel,
Yeah, they start, whoa, fire, whoa. I mean, there's a lot of just Fuego, Diego. The rhyming scheme, I'm not a big fan of. Especially when they start getting repetitive over and over again. But the verses do stand out a little bit, and there's one part that this song does shine. Some days, it's just not worth gnawing through the straps. Freak out and throw stuff, world's greatest dad. Read a little book about Vlad the Impaler. And then they do that little echoing piece of Vlad the Impaler.
That's the bizarre stuff I'm talking about, though. Those little echoes there. I mean, this is only the first verse. And then what's interesting is that we don't really return to a second verse right away. The second it starts phasing out like that, then we move on to a whole new thing. Then it goes into a jam. So the structure of this is already very, very odd. After the phase, the intro, and then a verse with kind of oddball lyrics to throw you right in there, and then we're in a jam.
But these aren't oddball lyrics. I can't really say that.
It's more the style in which they sung, that little fade out right there.
Yeah, these lyrics you would see all over the place with 60s and 70s music. These are just make you be faux intellectual.
No, it's not so much that I have a problem with it. Actually, lyrically, I'm kind of more intrigued by the lyrics at this point because I'm searching for the structure here.
It should be said while we're on structure that this is a 9-minute and 30-second song that starts the album.
Yes.
It's a long song that could have easily been multiple songs. I mean, at this point, after that fades out, you get this next section is just so divorced from the previous.
It's fun,
but it's a different song.
Fun. It is a different song. That's why I said this was a song in 3 parts. This mostly majorly B-ish section is very much a jam section. Very much a duality between the electric guitar and bass. Gets rid of the piano right away and introduces a keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of gets a little bit tropey.
Was that the organ-sounding keyboard there?
Yeah, it was a keyboard just because of the speed at which some of those notes were being played, but it was an electric organ-oriented keyboard.
Yeah, and along with the bass, I mean, to be honest, this is the part I really enjoyed. Once we get into the really, serious jam here, when the tempo kicks way up, I hate to kind of bash the structure of this album because of the fact that I enjoy this jam so much, but it's still a problem, in terms of connecting it as we are looking at a studio release. Either way, the jam, bracketed, is pretty awesome. I mean, The drums are out of this world, and it's just it's something that's probably one of the jams in this album I'd prefer more than any other, just because it's so engaging and it gets you moving throughout. I think it was a blast to listen to, and the harmonies, the tension on the organ is just beyond. It's beyond what it's better than this song, to be frank.
Well, part of the problem there, though, is that it's so divorced because, A, the transition was so poor from one part to the next. From this A to this B, it's like it was a start and stop practically. It might as well have been a separate track and a separate song. And then, the jamming was good and I liked it, but it just kind of... It just didn't fit with what came before.
I want to just clarify something you said, because I want to beware of being too harsh here. I don't believe that the intro sections were divorced from each other as much as I feel they were of a different character.
No, yeah, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that part A and part B, the intro...
It was a strong... Oh, yeah, part A into this jam was a strong drop. That's true.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how going into this jam, it was completely divorced. It was a start-stop practically. And this new jam session, while intriguing and interesting, had nothing to do with what we were listening to previously.
Now, as far as cohesion goes, this is a major issue. But
shame, because I really want to like it.
The whole thing is, this is not unexpected for me. This is music of the time when this band first came together.
Yeah, but I mean that's no different than me saying last week that Jack White being a little schizophrenic because he puts weird personality in his songs is what he does. It still doesn't always work musically, and the fact is, even if they're expected to be a little kind of all over the place, even if of the time, it still doesn't forgive the fact that it's still a little poor in a modern context.
And that's where the big issue comes in.
But I am going to say, though, I don't think the problem for me is really datedness. That's much less the problem than structure.
Well, I was just saying if he was explaining that the break and this breakdown was because of the datedness, then that doesn't excuse it. I don't agree either. I don't think it has anything to do with the datedness. I think it has everything to do with just poor musicianship in this specific transition. Something was missing. I'm
not saying it's an excuse, it's an explanation. That's all it is.
I'm also going to say that I think the worst of the two was the recomposition right back into the A section.
Yeah.
That was
keep thinking
that
it's
changed,
3 songs.
That changed on a dime. Yeah, there's not a third section here.
It goes back
to be clear, right
not...
after that. No. Right after that, it goes into what I would probably call the first chorus. It is new in that, but seriously, this is just a new melody over the same A major riff that we had just prior to the first verse. And it does expand, I think, from a more concise chorus into a totally improvised jam unto itself right after that.
Is that the guitar-piano combination?
Yeah, that actually was the outro that comprised a good portion of the last half of the song.
That was...
Third.
It may be built on the same framework, but the melody is just too different to really call it just A reimagined. Or an extension of that A section.
No, it's not A, as I said. It's the A major riff we had just prior to the first verse. It was sort of a jam earlier on. In other words, they expect us
expansion to it.
They expect us.
Yeah, but if you're still building off the initial piece, it's still similar to the A. You're just building on it.
He's talking about something just prior to the actual official A section. You're talking about one of the introductory reimagines, reinvigorate. So
it was the second. I would call it after the official introduction. Personally, you have those. All right, so you have those like 3 or 4 segments in the intro. Then you move into, I would call it a part 1, even though it's instrumental, it's purely on A major. Then we move into a verse, which is a little darker. Then we move into a sort of a pre-jam into the full center jam of this piece, which raises the tempo. And then it goes right back to the intro on a dime, which I thought was incredibly sloppy. Right at that point, we go into A again. And this time, it's that A section just prior to the first verse that they use as the framework for their chorus. Odd structure so far? I thought so too. But that's basically what they built here. And normally, I praise unique structures and whatnot, but this was asking a little bit much because I'm losing a center for this piece. I'm losing something to attach myself to. It has taken on upwards of 5 different characters so far.
We reward unique structure, but not unique structure at the hands of sanity. Like, it's not even just unique. It's unique, but it's also schizophrenic and running into the walls. Like, it doesn't know what it's doing. It's kind of just all over the place. And then even when it comes back to this normality or almost normality, it's still kind of weaving to find where it's supposed to be. It never finds its ground the whole track.
I mean, it pretends like it finds its ground, and this is actually kind of interesting. The second it starts up with that A section again, that is to say, A section prior to the first verse. Again, you can call this stuff whatever you want, but it's a way to visualize it. It does present this as if this is the culminating point of the piece, the climax, as it were. Bear in mind, we've only I think there's a problem in the fact that we've only had one verse up to this point, because the verse is your rising action, so to speak. And then you only get a little bit of that before we climax in a jam that is unrelated. So it's like we climaxed in a different story, in a different novel, before returning to the same novel, previous novel, and going about our resolution. What sense does that make?
No.
I'm trying to come up some sort of metaphor to explain how Fuego, fire, would explain all this, and I got something, but it's so weak, it's so out there. Honestly, I see that they were going for something. I'm not a big fan of what they kind of really were trying to represent here. It's fire burning out, it's all that sort of stuff. Diego,
not
did you
having
steal
it.
I know, no, it's weak. And I'm pretty sure this is where they're coming from. And just
I think very clearly they were just trying to come up with a bold and alluring intro, and indeed, it does act kind of like an overture, even though it totally doesn't have to do with anything else in the remainder of the album. It acts like an overture in that it has all these different sections, but it also is kind of tightly knitted in such a way that it really doesn't match the overture format, which really would be a sort of a segue into another segue, into another segue. That's not what this follows. It pretends to have a structure. I know that sounds like kind of a harsh word, pretends, but I think it's evading the fact that the overall arc of the track just didn't really leave me with anything. I could go back to these individual sections in this track and really have fun with them individually, but I'm gonna tune out the time the next one comes. That is my problem here. The final thing I have an issue with is actually the that last jam, which was
that
sort of a
super long jam.
the particularly long one here.
And it wasn't. This one wasn't really a jam so much as a flaring repetition.
That's the thing. It's fun, yeah, because it's an A, it's fun, but it's much less intense than the earlier jam that was raised tempo. That was solid, impressive. But this is just kind of long, and to be honest, I have somewhat of a personal bias against one chord jams. I do believe a lot of this was just on that one particular chord, especially when they're all in major, because they're just so damn happy. Not to sound like a curmudgeon, but I've always had I always had personal trouble, I think, as a musician with major chord jams, because when I was in a band in certain atmospheres in college, I would run out of ideas very easily, because transitions out of major after you've been jamming in major for a while tend to be a lot sloppier. Not that they were really running out of ideas here, but psychologically it never really seems enough for me. It always feels like there should be that next chord, that next thing. And
you're asking
this
where
track
is
kind
it
of
going?
peaked.
Where is it going?
Yeah,
it doesn't go anywhere.
It's a plateau, a steady plateau.
That ends up going nowhere.
Well,
yes.
Whatever a plateau does. I guess the infinite plateau, as it were. Of course, It's not infinite. We do have an ending. And the end actually does have some motion to it. They do pull out of major. The bass kept changing up the note just slightly to change up the chords just on the very last outro, moving it farther and farther away from major. That was interesting, but it was kind of a little too late. Only in that it did serve as a pretty good transition to the second song.
That's true. And although, I don't know, this song just built some kind of expectation. I don't know whether good or bad, but some kind of expectation that we don't really meet and we can get into that a bit even with the second track. But the second track, The Line, is... So my problem with The Line, that I hadn't realized, actually, is one of my first notes is, move straight along. The line is essentially a straight line through a... I don't know, is it a pop structure?
No.
It starts out discernibly reggae, actually.
Yes,
Okay.
and that actually...
Kind of got this, like, this offbeat bass. Like, literally. Like, the emphasis is on that offbeat. Which is kind of cool. And I actually assume from what I have heard of Phish that it is really up their alley. And then the 80s keyboard steps in after a while, which is sort of nostalgic. The melody here is the strongest. Sometimes I step back and I was surprised that it kept going because of the fact that the melody is almost seems like it's apart from the rhythm of the bass. And there's that cool, it seems to be all in 4/4, although it seems like they might occasionally throw in like a measure of 2 beats in there every once in a while. But either way, it still feels like they're two separate entities. The melody's rhythmic structure and then the bass's rhythmic structure. The bass's main riff that drives the track. That was a cool dynamic. Gotta say, I was impressed with that right up front.
It gave the verses... the verse, because we're only in the first one. It gave that verse, the first verse, kind of a dynamic that we really didn't have in the other song, and a cohesion for the track pretty much since it started. That... I don't know. I mean, it felt tighter than when we got to the chorus. Because once you get to the chorus of the song...
And that's where I didn't want... That's right there. Chorus. It's not a chorus.
What is it, then?
You think it's a chorus. It's actually a bridge. The way it's being used, because this song has a kind of a weird structure to it. It's either got 2 distinct choruses or an unusual format to it. Because it goes... It's sort of verse... Chorus A, verse, chorus A, chorus B, which gets repeated. Another verse, chorus A, chorus B, ad nauseum. And here's where...
That wasn't as odd to me, though, to be honest. I think that the structure was that pretty tight. With what you just described, rears on pop structure.
Yeah.
Blatantly.
Yeah, but here's the thing. That first chorus, which I'm going to call a bridge because of how short and sweet it is, and it does function as a bridge. In the overall scheme, more so than a chorus, is I loved how sweet and slow it got down to. I love how kind of methodical they decided to get that kind of groovy little that slow side. I like that sweet slowness that they put. And you step to the line, kind of falling back on itself, kind of just really stepping away, doing the exact opposite of what they're saying.
I'm in the middle here, because what you're describing now is that chorus that has that pretty standard 4-chord progression and whatnot. The jam never came, which I was actually expecting at this point. Instead, there was that very feel-good piano. I mean, the feel-good, it's walking, it's in the line, it's hard for me to really classify this, because on one hand, I want to say I did feel somewhat of the same thing as John, and maybe just the fact that this structure was a bit tighter than the previous track did kind of help me. Not to say, though, that it's anything groundbreaking. I mean, this had some things in common with Elton, and yet it still had that reggae thing that survived in. It was very uplifting.
It just felt very scatterbrained, though, too.
Oh, no. Scatterbrained is simply not the word for this. This is a very straightforward track. I don't see how you can really go
I
the
think it was
scatterbrained
because
route.
The big issue, and this is where I do see where sort of Storm's coming from, is that that second chorus that starts with "Try to see the future from the line," where it kind of goes into a completely different mode as the rest of the song from the other 2 parts of the song. It's another. Yeah, you got the same sort of rhythm being built throughout it, and there's nods towards the previous work, but that got really poppy.
It did.
And repetitive. And it was so...
Is this the chorus, or is this after the fact?
This is that other chorus. That's the only way I can explain it. It's another chorus. It is different from the bridge of You Stepped a Line. That sweet sort of melody. It gets kind of just a little too jumpy which doesn't match the reggae theme they were doing, and doesn't match the sweet melody they were trying to do in the other piece.
All right, then I'll take the other route here, and that is that I'm definitely not going to go so far as to call this like a great song, because even though I do think it has more direction and more of a place for me than the first track, it would fit swimmingly in a Barnes & Noble soundtrack, or even the department store thing that I like to mention, but yet not present day, like back in the 80s and 90s. So for me, this did feel a little bit dated, and you're right, the repetition there, I think the reason we find it so repetitive is because we find it a little bit dated. This time I'm using the dated word. This is one of those cases. I think it's just been there, done that. But it doesn't apply to the whole song. That's the thing. It doesn't apply to that previous chorus that you mentioned. It doesn't apply to the verses that that interesting beat work.
Well, yeah, I said that I enjoyed the verses, and I didn't think that they were that way at all.
Yeah. But I can't go so far as to use the word scatterbrained. You see my point. I still think the tonality is very it's fluid on this track, but it does seem like it lost its edge the second it goes for that second chorus.
Okay.
I think that's the problem. Like the edge that had been there, it just drops off.
I think it's because vocally and lyrically, even though it's not an expansive song at all, on either of those parts, there's a lot more investment in the verses than that chorus, that really repetitive chorus.
And then it seems like after that they decided to go the utmost safe route, like the safest idea one could possibly come up with for the framework of the song. It's not scatterbrained, it's direct. This is not a case of it being a separate song, a separate entity. It's a case of them going the direction that is going to please everyone. And of course, we don't always follow that because we're like, oh, we wanted more. But there are a lot of people, I think, out there who might just, they're going to... groove is the wrong word, but they're going to zone out to it the same way I always say that you zone out to tracks at department stores.
But if you listen to what the verses actually say, I love the line, dry mouth, push it out, I can hear my heart pound, a hero's what I'm not.
Yeah, I love that.
That's great. Voices scream, flashes flare, frozen as the people stare, my crucifixion shot.
And again, it's that rhythm that really makes this.
It does have a pretty distinct rhythm when it comes right down to it in those verses.
That's right out of the verse you're reading. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's the way the bass interacts with his meter of that particular verse that I just love. Beyond that, though, especially since we started talking about the later portion, I want to defend it only because I think the piano pop thing that this starts going for, once it gets there, is a little timeless to some extent. It's why we still listen to Elton. It's why we still listen to, Billy Joel and all that. But it does seem like it's kind of the dredges of their own work. Not that anything they ever did was crappy, although some people would certainly argue so. I still think this is like pulling from the bottom of that particular barrel.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, well,
so it's not something I can really, put the crappy stamp on. If it happens to bore a few people, well, that's okay, and it's not the most inventive in reference to that particular chorus.
It's not crappy, but it's not great either. It's just kind of okay. It's kind of in that middle.
Well, I think in that outro, that sixth-ish repetition, I was trying to just hang on at that point. I wanted something, anything. Could just move forward, go back to the bridge, repeat the verse again. Repeat the first verse. I don't care. Just give me back in that groove.
Give me the verses.
Give me the verses.
Just give me all the verses.
This chorus is just, especially that outro, just dragged. Dragged.
I am also going to say, the more I think about it, you're right. I mean, I'm right. Scatterbrain is the wrong word, but I'm going to give you some leeway on that. I do think that there's a problem just with the fact that the verses are so intricate, and then the chorus is so dull. And that's not to say that's not looking at the issue of just the chorus as being dull. I'm saying it actually does cause a problem in transition, because it sort of creates this halting cyclical structural pattern of this track, because it did, I mean, on one hand, it's breaking the mold by doing that. On the other hand, it really can't decide where it is. It can't decide whether it wants to be a pop song or a very, very particularly edgy reggae track. So that is a bit more of a distinction. I won't go so far as scatterbrained, but there's something almost tantamount to a divorce there in just execution. And especially the end, once it gets to that piano solo, that very feel-good piano solo that just it jams out to, it almost had this song that never ends kind of feel. Like, it felt like, I mean, I believe, if I'm not correct, it goes to a fade-out, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
A very typical fade-out.
Yeah. And it wasn't, I mean, the piano solo was kind of take it or leave it at that point, because you already are familiar with the overall character of the track, and a piano solo kind of just slips right in there. Wasn't going to blow you away.
It was long enough you could both take it and leave it. It was just ad nauseum.
It was long enough for you to decompress.
Or get compressed.
Yeah. To some.
And speaking of compression...
What?
Devotion to a Dream. I'm doing a bad segue.
Terrible segue.
Yeah, it's a terrible segue.
Well, good job.
Thank you.
That fits nowhere here.
I don't know. I'll try to find something.
You work
Devotion to a Dream.
So yeah, this one is where I start to get annoyed, I guess. My issue with this song right off the bat is
you know how much of a curmudgeons we're coming off as right now, though, because outwardly this song begins so cheery, like, I mean, super cheery. I understand the sigh of exhaustion here, because we're not terribly into what I just branded as department store music, but I felt like Muppets are going to break out at any minute here. This had much more of a Ben Folds feel, more of that modern piano rock vibe. So I'll get back to your exhaustion, but I want to convey that this is still kind of it's a positive thing. I'm not going to feel depressed when I listen to this.
No,
wrong.
But my frustration isn't from the emotion of the song, it's the emotions I'm going through listening to the song. I'm just so annoyed that Phish is putting out processed department store pop rock. Like,
I would not say that this
I can't even go that far.
It's processed country rock, not
okay,
pop.
country rock, who cares?
Because
it's
after
processed
that,
and predictable, though, this song.
No. There is one silver lining on this gray cloud. Because every silver lining's got a gray cloud. The lyrics in this song are really standoutish.
But would you have gotten those lyrics just by listening to it?
Yes, because there's so little going on otherwise. I got the lyrics on a first take.
This is why we have the three of us here, because John can always pick up these lyrics first.
Yeah,
I personally
These lyrics
didn't.
I picked up.
I didn't either.
Right away.
I'm with Steve. I was so annoyed, and not annoyed, but I was just so disillusioned with the rest of the song that I didn't care to pay enough of attention to the lyrics.
And you're second on that list in more likely to notice lyrics, so...
Yeah,
that says something.
In fact, there was a interesting effect which didn't quite come off as epic as they were going for. But when they started doing the first verse, after the first two lines of the verse, they actually put the chorus within the verse in an echoey chorus actual situation, going back and forth with no more phone calls when. And then chorus breaks in, it's today's the vows are broken. You don't say what you mean, it's today the charade is open. It's that back and forth that was kind of refreshing and created a nice little duality to it, but it was surrounded by kind of lackluster, I think would be the word, everything else. The vocals weren't truly moving.
Okay, I'm going to convey my overall impressions of this track here. In sequential order. Dug the bass a little more here. Was glad to hear the organ reprise, just sparingly in the background. I kind of loved the whole choir chorus feel. It really was catchy, even if it was a little bland by what we were expecting, especially after the dramatic first track. But the crux here begins with the riff. The riff, the overall riff that guides this song through, was just so boring to me. After a while, it just had that same aimless, happy feel. And this is where I think Matt's issues are justified from where he began with this track. That it's not so much that you're sighing at the fact that it's, oh god, I've heard this already, but it is almost like, yeah, you've heard this already. It's happiness light. And if you're going to feel happy, you might as well feel really happy. You might as well go balls to the wall with it. This is interesting in the fact that we actually are dealing with more chords here than we were dealing with, like, say, that happy outro in the first track, that happy jam feel. We're dealing with more chords, more of the whole pop feel here, and the structure here was less evasive to me than in the previous track, that whole reggae structure with the odd rhythms. And that was one of my main reasons for actually accepting that track into one of my more preferable songs on this album, just because of that subtle manipulation of pop structure. But this, however, it had none of that. It was totally straightforward, and the riff did not help. It felt like something I've heard before. And it leaves you, especially considering that country rock backdrop here, which, yes, dips into Ben Folds, yes, it dips into Elton, but that's just highlighting the fact that there's a lot of Elton influence in Ben Folds. Either way, it does still have this, like, you're driving, and you're just trying to stay only uplifted enough that you do not fall asleep at the wheel. But you're on, like, one of the straightest roads in America, just heading due west, and you've been doing that for, like, 5 hours. More than that, it's the company that you keep. I feel like I'm watching a movie about two really boring people driving across country.
And yet, lyrically, it's actually a pretty deep kind of introspective look at a relationship. I love this line. This is one of my favorite lines on the actual album.
There's no moment in this track that highlights that emotionally from a musical perspective, though.
Yet, listen to this. No more promises, no more keeping score, no more wondering what I stay here for. We broke the awkward silence with polite and practiced lies, while images occupied our minds.
See, that's interesting. That really is interesting, but here's the thing.
It's so uneventful in its presentation.
Well,
I could only justify it on this one account, and this is going to be very divided between those out there who like this kind of thing or not. If you're driving to something, and I have met a lot of people who prefer to drive to music that you don't have to focus on too much. Now, the funny thing is that for me that works a little bit opposite, because as a driver, I find that I actually can focus on the music considerably when I'm driving, because really the driving becomes the activity that you can put second most in your mind, especially if you're a good driver and you've been driving long enough. Then you should be able to somewhat zone out to the road, and all of the alertness that goes into driving should be second nature to you. Then you can focus on the music. So why would you want background music there? But that's just me. There is that other portion who prefer the background music, in which case this is kind of an interesting take on that total zone out driving while perhaps contemplating things that are a little bit more closer to home, as you gather from these lyrics.
Yeah,
but my biggest problem with...
I'm not saying that's a theme or anything, but I'm saying that is the genre twist. That is the medium for which this is used. I don't hate this track. That's the thing.
I don't hate it either. I don't...
It's extremely unoffensive.
Well, the biggest problem with this track and mentioning
extremely unoffensive is our biggest compliment.
The biggest problem with this track and the lyrics that John is citing is that I got none of that emotionally from hearing it, and that's a problem. When you have lyrics that are that poignant, red, but I get nothing from the track, that's a complete emotional disconnect. That is going to fault the song hard. And again,
right, but if you follow what I said, that very well could be people do not always link their music with their immediate goings on.
Yeah.
So it serves a different population in that.
I guess, but it's not me, and I don't think it's. I just don't think it's
just as long as we're covering all bases.
I just don't think it's a great idea to have a distinct and highly divided, thick divider between your emotional well-being and what the song's trying to convey. I think the fact that the lyrics only have an impact from being read, or have a much higher impact from being read, is a problem.
Unless, revisit my theme here, the two very, very boring people driving across country are so not in touch with their emotions. And they're trying to keep from killing each other. Yeah.
All right.
Nope, putting a pin in it. You're John. Nope. Nope, not having
Okay.
it.
The John thing.
I'm going to say a lot of things to you that should not be said on air right now after the podcast for what you just said to Steve.
Oh, because I called him you?
We're going to have a murder on the podcast if you keep this up.
So track 4.
We're the two people. Oh, God.
It's snuff radio. That's exactly what we're getting
See,
at
we're the
here.
two people. See, the third one's already dead.
Yeah, I got
Dead,
it.
Dead, you got it? All right.
Next, you're going to tell me Soylent Green is people.
Ugh.
It's people.
Halfway to the moon. Much funkier exposition.
Yes.
Kind of like that. That bass, love it. Can't be tamed.
Mysterious.
Although, this is just another bias. I have frequently mentioned how much I personally love funk, so this totally just went into my realm here automatically. Not so much, that the overall tone of this album is really changing here, but it's more so that it's a jam that, especially if you're talking about funk, it's a jam that often does center around a single major chord, a lot of times with funk. But with an added flair. There's attitude that goes with funk to me, which sort of now allows me to ignore all that I said earlier about said earlier jams that are just major for the sake of major. Happy-go-lucky, let's just keep driving. You're crying on the inside. This is not that. This is funk. You actually feel like you can get moving to it, in which case, perfect place to zone out to.
Yeah. Yes.
This is the fine lines that you ride, though, when you're talking about happy jams. Because there's those
also,
two distinct types. That's the fine line that exists between I'm bored or I'm invested, keep it going. You follow?
Right. And I follow, and I agree with the instrumentation of this song. I definitely agree that funk really, really gets you grooving and really gets you moving. The problem is then, after a minute, is it a minute? Maybe a little less. The vocalist comes in, and he should be having a blast with this funk track, and he is not. He couldn't be more bored. He's the emotional baseline of a flat line.
That is not true. He could, in fact, be more bored. There is inflection in this, but the inflection is within such a narrow range that it's like a wet blanket on everything else that was going on musically. The vocals are so mediocre, middling, just no
and
highs, no lows.
And there's a flat delivery in his tone, and it really kind of kills any emotional connection.
The vocals feel like they have a curfew. They have to be home by 9.
What? Okay, I'm
Okay.
calling you
I
out on
attempted
that
another
metaphor.
John metaphor.
Oh,
You're both gonna hear it.
I love it. Anyway, they have a cap. It feels like they could do so much more with this given framework. Reach up a little bit higher, reach lower. There's a problem with inflection here. They are sort of just in the zone and not really pushing those boundaries too much. That was one of my biggest gripes here. And then the other big gripe I have is just that the development here was really, really slow. I mean, we went from this intriguing exposition centering around funk, where the rhythms are trickier and hence usually more interesting, and it just jives the right way for me. Can't explain it. But, and even the chords, like as it progresses, it does darken it up a bit at times, so we actually have some substance here, some depth. But that's just the exposition. I'm so less impressed with the rest because of this development. It's ambling. And the piano solo, which we do get after a little bit, even it, groovy, cool, but kind of lax and a little safe. And I hate to say that the second a piano solo comes along, because normally I'm just smitten. But even it felt constricted by the chord progression. It just repeats the primary phrase a lot, and then again has almost the analogous problem to the vocals. It just is in that middle range. It could be reaching. It could be doing fancier things.
it could be lower notes, higher notes.
It's not so much about lower and higher as just sort of stepping into the spotlight a bit. But it feels like it's been given a certain volume maximum and a certain fun threshold level maximum, and that's all it will be allowed to do. I felt like there's so many things in this song that we're trying to fight the chord progression, and that's just the main problem. The riff, similar to the last track, it just got boring again. Like even the funk riff, I hate to say it got a little boring, especially toward the end. You got the major 1 to minor 4, as if that's a hint at something unresolving, but yet it kept resolving.
The lyrics speak to a sort of like stream of consciousness kind of idea of just what you're thinking of. And a lot of times this can be very enjoyable. That's kind of what was going on with the line. That was kind of what was going on with Devotion to a Dream. But unlike those tracks, and unlike other bands like Laszlo Bane or Modest Mouse, when they do that kind of stream of consciousness lyrical work, it gets fun and enjoyable. This is kind of the subconscious, I'm bored stream of thought. The music is playing that same way. It's just, it's the back of your mind when you're kind of thinking about work and what you have to do for tomorrow. It's nothing high energy. It's nothing that really is for mind, forethought, thinking about anything important.
I won't go so far with that in this track. I do think the overall funk framework kind of left it a couple notches above the previous track for sure. But
the way it just keeps going on and on and on,
I think it's a loss.
Brings it back to the back of your mind there.
Yeah, I guess that's right. In terms of progression, it gets pushed further to the back of your mind than you really expect from the outset, and that's a tragic thing considering they had such a good idea in the beginning. It doesn't make the best of what it has.
No,
that's really the problem.
Falls short, essentially.
I will say, however, that the closing piano solo, the final piano solo / jam, was better than the prior one. I'll admit that. But I think the overall ratio of this just bothered me. Length, repetition, won over the interesting idea work that did surface, but I don't know. I can't really add this up. It was clouded by that 2-chord progression, that major 1 to minor 4. When you think about it, the piano was very understated in the production work, where it could have been spotlighted a lot more.
And if they'd spotlighted it, it might have even helped here and in later tracks if they'd spotlighted it there as well. I think the problem is that they're kind of taking that jam band mentality of, oh, let's just see where it goes, man.
And it goes nowhere.
Yeah.
Winter Queen.
Yes,
Ooh,
track 5.
Winter Queen.
So we for the first time in the album, we get something that's actually a little intriguing. The overall backdrop for this song is this kind of mood music that it conveys very early on in the intro.
Well, even you think the word Winter Queen, and so far everything is jiving with the title. You get that sound of cool, gentle wind in the foreground, and then in the background, super distant guitar, just comping delicately. Really tasteful. I mean, this actually plays around with volume more than any of the previous tracks did, where everything was kind of just mid-range.
Listening to this in the car for the first time, I thought my window was open. And I listened to it again on headphones after that, and it was the biggest depth we've gotten on this album just because of that. Even though it is so very simple, so easy to actually conceptually make, it has a depth to it just by being pointed.
Well, if we haven't proved anything this far along in our podcast, obviously simple never means boring. In fact, there's been many intricate things going on this album so far, to be honest. But it wasn't enough to really reach that next threshold. Whereas this just seems very straightforward and honest, and that's the main thing that it's got going for it. Beyond that, let's move to melody. Melody here got a little bit of reverb. The vocals actually have a pleasant vibrato here. Well, that was interesting because it was also, I haven't heard great, outstanding vocals yet on this album, and this had kind of an edge to it, where he felt he was at least in line with the mood, and yet he seemed a little bit separate in character, perhaps because his volume was turned up so high that it took the spotlight away from that background, which I was enjoying a little more.
Yeah, but I would at least say at this time that the lyrics, I noticed the lyrics in the song because there was an inflection and there was, more importantly, some semblance of emotion in this track. You got this kind of mood fluctuation feel. And the lyrics, the way he was singing, conveyed that. It kind of put you through these
Which is why I'm
motions.
willing to overlook the volume thing, really.
It's also the way that they use the pacing of allowing the lyrics to come forward, his vocals to come forward, and then to recede, and have a big break between lines that gave what he was saying so much more importance, even though it could have stood up on its own, like the lyrics themselves, and one of the lines really touches me.
Well, I think the instruments actually could have stood off on their own, so you could go either way with that.
Like this would work by itself as poetry on top of being part of a song. This isn't one that stands only with its music; it stands alone as well.
And this could have worked as an instrumental without the poetry.
But together, it does. I'm not having a problem with the volume. I think it stands better than either would separately, because it's when he does the final verse, because there's no real choruses here.
No, there is definitely a chorus. Actually, I remember
one chorus, but it doesn't get repeated. So can you call it a chorus?
Oh, we've done that plenty of times. You can sense a chorus whenever it's got this inherent climactic quality to it. But I remember distinctly that the chorus was interesting because it actually had somewhat of a jam beneath it, sort of between a bass drum, guitar, keyboard, all started stacking up here, which I think it kind of pushed this forward a little bit. It did bring us out, I think, of the cool, gentle setting that we were in, the winter setting, as we are talking about the Winter Queen here. It felt very cool. It felt very solitary, but we do get a little bit more busy at this point. And I didn't necessarily have a problem with that because it was a slow, tasteful build. It wasn't, like they were trying to force any one thing on us. And it goes even further later on, especially by the time it gets to the horn work. That was one of my favorite parts because it introduces more instruments. And otherwise, prior to this, instruments have been, kind of stagnant. We know what to expect in this particular set here that Phish has got going. But they brought in horns and this very clean electric guitar sound. Both really rise together and fall together, build into a climax where the keyboard can take us into the final mini verse, which you could argue isn't as necessary, but I think it was a pretty clever way to close out this track. All of which was just jiving for me.
Well, it was the combination. That guitar work, I don't think would even have been as pointed if I hadn't heard the lyrics directly preceding it. Prince of music on guitar neglects to play a single bar, but music trapped inside his head resounds and fills the space instead. I love that.
It's a very powerful line.
That is nice.
And it really does push out the end of the track as far as giving you this sense of void, but not void as in emptiness. This kind of...
It's a sweeping power?
Yeah, this kind of airiness of this winter scene.
And to even go back to the first opening lines, the Winter Queen looks up and sighs as your closer, is both depressing and empowering.
And it resolves the song very well. The song actually resolves it very well. It doesn't just taper off or end suddenly. It wraps up in a nice nature that doesn't feel forced or feel...
You might say that it does end a little suddenly, but it ends on that... It ends on an ambiguous note, which I tend to like as far as endings go. It always leaves you wanting something more, and I think that's an okay thing to leave you on.
It's okay to leave you wanting more as long as it's giving you something. It's when you get nothing.
As long as it gave you enough
want
up
more.
until that point, of course.
Yeah.
I will see this track in terms of three different levels of expectations. I think in the beginning I was immediately just whisked away by exposition. But then in the middle, there was a little bit of a problem that I had with, even though the verses, they're kind of soothing, so I'm not going to be a dick and use the word boring here, but it does feel like it belongs as part of a soundtrack to a PBS morning kids show. That was one thing I noted. here, because it gets a little bit too soothing, like it's trying to kind of dumb me down a bit. Either way, and I suppose you might say that pulled me away from the exposition, but I still like the slow, tasteful build, so brings me to the third final expectation of this. I was once again blown away by the amount of instrumentation that they brought in here. The climax was solid. Probably one of the best climaxes on any track on this album.
It might be the only climax on this album.
Actually, yeah, considering we have so much mid-range stuff.
Speaking of mid-range stuff.
And that takes us into track 6, Sing Monica.
So initially when I had heard this song the first time, I kind of got into it only because the chorus was so singable, but upon multiple listens I realized that it's kind of crap. I mean, it's not... No, actually I'm going to be harsh on this track, screw it. This is a crappy Phish song. It's a crappy song. It's totally predictable. This is the pop song. This one, step by step, is a song that you could guess beat for beat, from the choruses to how it's sung to what the lyrics will be to the drum beats. I mean, it just...
You can even predict the lyrics. I kind of almost expected a soft trailing G repetition after a hard plural T rhyming scheme. Like, I was getting to the point where I could almost predict what the next words were going to be used to rhyme. Not what was rhyming with the actual word starts, but what the next pair of rhymes were going to be. It was getting to be almost that predictable. Lyrically and vocally. This is another song that, while he's not really being in a middling range, he just kind of stays in that high energy and expects us to go along with it.
I got one good thing to say about this track.
Ooh,
The phasing was an interesting choice. Some sonic diversity just in the effect realm, which we don't get too much of. Although this is a good time to bring up my earlier comment from the very beginning in how the same stuff could be achieved on stage. A part of me liked the premise, for instance, of Wintergreen, the previous track, because those effects in the really beginning, they can't really be achieved on stage. That's something that is certifiably studio-worthy. Other than that, though, a lot of this track here is easily transferable. Phasing is something you can do on stage. So it's so similar to a live album that I've lost distinction. It isn't special. It's a real throwaway track. It's not so much a jam as it is an endless refrain.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't really have a terrible amount more to say about this track.
Don't even read along on this one.
Yeah, the lyrics aren't really worth it either.
You
Not
charged me up, excited me, upended and rewrited me. You hooked me up, you wired me. But when my tread was worn, retired me.
I mean, I don't think that's so bad, to be honest. This is not what I'm focusing on in a track like this. Although perhaps it wants you to,
I had nothing musically to focus on in this case.
And also, these lyrics are
wondering.
very sing-songy, children's story kind of line. Just, and rhyming the same, third word in every sentence. It's really childish.
There's no long form here. It's short snippets.
And it's funny how the music actually reflects that, like how I'm talking about this being an endless refrain. It does feel as if they're jamming out to it, but don't be fooled. This is not so much a jam in the fact that I detect a lot of instruments doing this intricate solo work. It's really just repeating the same phrases over and over again to jam out. And that's using the metaphorical speak. Jam out as in you just sort of keep the ending going for a while. But don't move it in new places. Don't do anything particularly interesting. Just keep it going for just maybe a minute longer so we get to that last timestamp. That's what I detect here. I can't really go too far beyond that. I also want to beware of being a little bit too harsh here. I still don't think the music is terrible. It's just not interesting. That's the problem. It's all been there, done that, and I don't think this really fit the studio album framework too much. On that note, I'd like to go into something much more fun. Track 7, 555.
So this, from the very get-go, gives you a wonderful funk groove that we have not heard since... when did we hear it? What was the last track that had a funk groove with that? Was that The Line? That had the funk groove?
It wasn't too long ago. No, Halfway to the Moon, track 4.
Oh, Halfway to the Moon, okay.
But instead of just completely destroying it, it works a little bit further. It propels itself a little bit further in this introduction than what we got in Halfway to the Moon. I felt like Halfway's funk just stagnated very quickly for me. While here, I felt like they were actually trying to have fun and trying to use funk to be fun.
That's actually an interesting way to put it. Yeah, and this is gonna go down a tonal preference route, but I think it was a more genuinely funk track because minor. I don't know. Maybe that's, again, it's what I keep saying about major chords. It doesn't always leave a lot of room for development, but when you're in minor, you can do really, really interesting things. So here you have that minor framework, really, really great rhythms. The keyboard steps in, and the comping here is just the soul of this track. I love that tonality. It brings out brings Billy Preston to mind, actually. I mean, almost the same exact. I forget the name of the keyboard that he used, but this is totally right in that realm. In addition, there's these little accents that are visited by, I almost want to call them like gospel accents, because a choir steps in to iterate these accents as if they are commenting, like, in the middle of like a church choir. But it's very sparing, but it's an interesting rhythmic tool. I will say, though, my issue with this is the vocalist.
He is bored.
This
isn't boring. The vocalist isn't even on board on this one.
Well, and the worst part is he's not even trying to sell it. And how can you get behind a song where the vocalist doesn't sell it? I mean,
especially when the song actually does have a great groove to it. I mean, you got to put your best in. Well, you got to match the instrumentation.
I will say this about certain pop artists: even if the songs are kind of lackluster, when you emotionally sell a lyrical line or an inflection, or even just in style, it at least puts some oomph behind what's happening, and then you can kind of get on board.
I think the story that they were going for here was supposed to be depressing, or maybe even a little bit combative.
But he doesn't sound like that.
Yeah, the vocals don't even come close to combative, and depressing. Maybe he's just never been depressed before and doesn't know what it can sound like.
I wouldn't make that sweeping generalization, but the song does not hint to anything other than that. It's just I don't know. I'm very.
It's. They bought my soul for a pile of cash. Everybody else got paid out. They're closing in. I gotta dash. I gotta find a way out. I think I had more inflection in my voice than he did. It was maddening that it was, once again, just this wet towel on top of everything else. And he didn't care this time. It felt like he didn't care.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go so far as to make any claims about, inspiration or anything. I think this is one of those cases where it strikes me that the vocals were an afterthought. And I can't really speak to this either, but it comes off as such. As much as you want to look at, especially as a listener, as these tracks being these tightly knit products that were just instantly formed, all ideas, all at once. Often, it's a matter of chronology. You come up with a groove, and then you build on it, and then at some point you add some harmonies, and then maybe you add a melody, or maybe the melody came first. I'm sorry, I feel like his singing on this came absolutely last, and it wasn't able to. Well, actually, come and think of it, I'm retracing my steps a little bit here. Could be just the opposite. If the melody was written for a song that ended up getting more funkier in the aftermath. Point is, it's an issue of chronology, and the product is that you have something that lags far behind the other thing, and it's blatant. It's hard to ignore.
Well, it's been rampant on this record too. Things not measuring up to other things. I mean, that's the part.
That's been more over the horizontal, in a structural perspective.
Oh, all right,
This is
yeah.
actually at the moment, like vertically in the moment. I noticed something's awesome, something else is not so awesome. That's
All right,
the issue.
That's fair. Moving on to track 8, Waiting All Night, which,
Okay,
if you didn't know the title of the song by us telling you,
you will know it very soon.
because when you listen to it, it's all they ever say for part of the song.
I'm not gonna let you badmouth this song.
No.
I'm not gonna let you badmouth the exposition, especially. Exposition here, beautiful. I'm flat out saying it. I can't be in so much of a curmudgeonly state at this point in the album to ignore what's going on here. It opens up with this really airy ninth chord, which is built around a rhythm that I would liken somewhat to bossa nova. Kind of got that beat to it, very light. Picture Girl from Ipanema, the most commonly known bossa nova track.
I would
and
say,
picture
yeah.
how light that is, like lounge music that's not supposed to sort of invade your territory too much, or whatever little romance you're brewing off in the side table. And at the same time, it paints and actively is painting a picture, painting a setting for you to engage yourself in. This does the same exact thing. Don't ask me why rhythm has that power, but it easily does, and it provides this track with a lot of depth. And then, after that, we get these little guitar accents, loving that too. Overall, this is just a mood kind of song. It's not that it really goes a lot of places here. It's a fairly stagnant track, but what it has going for it is that constancy. And that's actually to its benefit. A lot of tracks, as we just mentioned, structure-wise, don't have that constancy. They will switch it up. They'll move to something completely different. This particular track has got its emotion picked out.
Well, yeah, I'll say that the slow burn, kind of slow build nature of this track really helps it along. The fact that it gives itself some time to develop and goes somewhere, but it takes its time and finds those moments is what really makes this song much better than a lot of the other tracks on the record.
It has a smooth to it. Smoothness. It is a long, drawn-out piece. But there's issues, and that is in the first half. This track, the first half and the second half, really became polar opposites for me. The first half had vocals that were trying to do, I guess, sad again or depressing. Didn't work too well because they were a little bit too much at the forefront. It's when the majority of the actual vocal work was over and it became that exposition. When it became just about the instruments that they started building complexity, doing minor changes to the chordal work, minor key changes to the guitar work, that the smoothness you thought that melody first had really became so much more intricate.
That's a good observation. And it is
that's-
kind of
it's
highlighting
when-
how, in general, on this album, the vocals have very rarely aided the track. It all seems to be the instruments.
And it was other little things, too. Little electronic warbles, little electronic pulls.
Oh, yeah.
That really just added a lot of texture to the simplicity. And then they brought back the vocals, but in such a way, such a background, outside the room, edge of what they were saying, just echoing into the rest of the music, that really did create the first major combination of powerful vocals, not powerful lyrics, but powerful vocals with powerful music.
Also,
and it did something that had not been achieved on the album before. Even Winter Queen, I was getting more strength from the lyrics than the vocals. Just
Yeah.
because of what was being said. This was really the only time I was getting how it was being said to be moving.
Yeah. Also, there should be some relation with the title, "Waiting All Night." You should expect some level of steadiness throughout this, as it is bound to be it's implied to be somewhat of a 3-4 o'clock in the morning track. So it's got its mindset picked out. It's got its emotion picked out. I was very happy with the goal here and the way they achieved it. The nitpicks, they're kind of we've already said them in general, and they do breach into this track, but certainly not so heavily because the core idea was so strong. And with that, I would like to move on to the next track, which I think we'll all have some interesting things to say on. Wombat.
So I'm pretty confident that this is hands down everyone's favorite track on the record.
I like Wintergreen more, but this is a
Winter
Queen more, but this is a close runner-up.
So this song, I mean, first of all, just from the first few seconds, you get immediately a sense of playfulness and fun that you really didn't get in a lot of other places in the record. They're finally kind of letting go of themselves and just going for it. Seeing where the moment takes them and building this kind of, this playhouse that they can work within. They gave it parameters, and then they bounced off the walls, and they created this thing that you kind of giggled at, but went along for the ride.
This song also is like a piece that's under construction being built right before your eyes. It starts off with, in this case, satirically good bad vocals and very light, almost acoustic guitar work that, honestly, it's almost bad, but in that it's actually pretty damn good because it progresses fairly rapidly into interesting pieces.
For that reason, it does come off as satire, doesn't it? One interesting thing that you mentioned, Matt, was just a minute ago, was how it sees where the moment takes them. And that's funny, considering that we thought we were going to get so much of that, here on this album, coming from a jam rock perspective. Instead, we had these structural shifts where they saw not where the moment takes them, but where the allotted interval takes them, and where it takes them in that particular moment, which is not always the great choice, because it defies linear thought. It actually creates markers, and if you are only beholden to those markers, then that's no longer linear. That's sort of self-inflicted linear thought. It's a little odd. This, you're right, does actually stay a little bit closer to that. And yet, at the same time, it comes off to me as more meticulous. Now, who knows? Again, we can sit here theorizing all day as to whether this was... the rhythms here were painstakingly thought out and then reconstructed, or whether they were perhaps reconstructed from a total fluid improvisation, a jam session. I'm inclined to believe that because of that satirical quirk we noticed in here, I'm thinking it did come out of an improvisation, but we'll never know this for sure. I want to talk about tonality here now, because once again, I'm throwing out the word funk here, and yet I can't go all the way with that, because this goes beyond what I even know of funk. This, I'm going to use this term perhaps for the first and last time ever, avant funk. This is what I get from this.
Definitely the last time ever. Let's go with the last time ever.
Avant funk.
Nah, I hope I get to use it again. I really do.
I thought funk was supposed to be avant.
Not at all. Funk is probably the easiest form of bass to learn, even though it's awesome.
Wow.
Wow.
Either way.
I think that might be the first and last time we've heard, awesome said in such a way.
From Steve, at least.
Yes.
Anywho, accents here. Kind of like on the, you hear these little guitar accents step in over this bass line. And it steps in odd moments in the measure, like the 3 and. It'll just come in there quickly and then depart. And then maybe a couple of measures later, it'll come at the same part and then depart. Again, we have singing that is almost akin to Red Hot Chili Peppers. This sort of...
Matter-of-factual.
I'm definitely not going to go so far as to say anything like rap rock yet, but it does have a flow to it, the flow that you would almost get out of rap. That rapid-natured, matter-of-factual conveyance.
Yeah, and there's one part where, honestly, it's my favorite musical part of the entire album, and it's coupled with the lines, spit out the seeds, gnaw on the pulp, suck on the juice, and simmer the rinds. And it undergoes
playful,
2 or 3 almost tonal shifts in just those short little lines. That was the point where me and Steve had a reaction we looked at each other and went, "Oh yeah, that was pretty good right there. That was really good."
It's great stuff. So that's the thing. Throughout this entire track, you have all these little intriguing moments and eyebrow raising. It really is. It's all It's all glitter, and I'm okay. I'm okay with that.
It's so different from one another, but they do feel like they're connected.
Yeah. Another thing, like an example of such, is the rests. Very meticulous. Like I said before, it almost fools you enough into thinking this is some sort of great jam. But now, the more and more I think about this, I'm leaning more toward a meticulous composition here. Because when every instrument, just knows to rest at that particular moment, and then they pull out, only for maybe a beat or a half a beat, whatever, and then falls right back in with another following accent. This back and forth is just, it keeps you moving non-stop. And then we have horns again. Horns, not unlike we got a little bit earlier with, what was the track that had horn work here?
Winter Queen.
Yes, Winter Queen.
Mm-hmm. But they were definitely more prominently featured here
definitely
than they were.
More prominently featured. And they step in almost to create this perfect post-70s, big band orchestrated funk, like the kind you'd find back in 1970s blaxploitation films, which, for all the opinions you might have about the film, great music. One of the dominant composers for that brand of music was Gene Page, who was hired to orchestrate a lot of those films. It seems to me like a forgotten art, but you will probably hear me say this in other episodes whenever I can, because it's a fascinating thing to delve into, I think, and an untapped greatness that can still be gotten out of it. This is an amazing move from that perspective. This is like an art piece off of that concept. And then they get the horns at the end. It takes like the last 30 seconds of this to move it into the next level. They expand to get very melodic. There's the horns I'm talking about. They deepen the tone. They add in these little repeating phrases that almost feels like it's going to move into another thing. But that's the perfect moment for this track to just sort of phase out. It's great. Beyond that, the lyrics are hilarious to listen to. Beyond the stuff that
Herbivore
that John
why are they
mentioned.
Cuddly but muscular? The wombat.
Cuddly but deadly, and that's like in the background, as if it's a little comment on
like,
the dominant singer. Yeah. The dominant singer it's kind of like the theme to the Phish TV show, as if it's like they came up with the riff, and that I assure you came out of improvisation, and then they just decided to say, yeah, it is kind of like a theme. This is the theme to the Phish TV show, and they just kept the microphone running, and they put that in the album. Great ideas.
It was at the end, they're just going out on herbivorous, crepuscular, cuddly but muscular, and just repeating that over and over again. And this is one time where repetition makes the heart grow fonder.
I will be fair with one thing, though. I think that someone could easily come across to this track and comment on how utterly ridiculous it is. Perhaps to the point of fault.
I have an allusion to a previous song we've done, and that is because we mentioned it when we were listening to it. They might be giants, darlings of Lubberland. This is something that really is kind of out of left field. It's not nearly as good as Darlings.
I was going to say that.
But I would make the comparison in style and how they approached making this song.
It's interesting enough, and to be honest, it raises my eyebrow as much as Darlings did.
That's true.
Now I do like Darlings more.
Well,
I don't know. I might see how I feel about this at the end of your review.
This is a lot of fun. It doesn't have the emotional depth, and that's where it falls.
This has no connection to Darlings. None. Sorry.
No, just in style.
I'm saying...
let
me finish. I'm saying it can't hold a candle to Darlings as far as amazement and wow factor. But I do see how you're saying it's unique to the album, much like Darlings was. However, also...
Frankly, I think that your experience with this album up to this point is affecting your view on that a little bit. Had we heard this independently and without somewhat of the train wrecks that we had previously, your opinion might be different on that. Because it is vehemently apart from this album in terms of complexity and inspiration.
I just said that. I just said it sets itself apart from the rest of the album.
Well, sure, it sets itself apart from the rest of the album. I'm saying that your experience with the rest of the album is affecting your experience with this track.
Okay, but I'm not quite sure you understand what I'm saying, because I'm saying that it does stand out.
No, it's the comment
But
that
that's
it
the
doesn't
difference
hold
between
a
that
candle
and Darlings of Lumberland is we
Darlings.
already had plenty of intriguing They Might Be Giants tracks leading up to that point. That was like the icing on the cake. This is an icing...
this is
Oh,
a
I'm
close
just saying that the
icing
two
without a cake.
Well, I'm just saying I like Darlings way better, was what I was saying. As a song, standalone. That's more or less what I was saying, but it doesn't hold the candle.
That's because this is a
That's
fun...
too harsh for me.
A fun, musically intriguing...
I don't
but it
understand
doesn't
how
have
it's
the depth.
harsh.
I'll say that Storm probably doesn't have the depth of emotions with it, and I would definitely agree with that. Darlings had a dark mystique to it, while this is a little bit too face value.
No, I could
really
easily
go.
see how Darlings of Lumberland would be perceived. I mean, I think the fact that you had an emotional connection... I don't think I had much of an emotional connection with Darlings of Lumberland, to be honest.
I just thought it was
it
beautiful.
had somewhat of a mystique, but, mystique can be achieved in various ways. So, this is an odd comparison, frankly.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a terrible comparison, but especially if we start going down the road of well, I prefer this and I prefer that. That's not entirely relevant. But I do believe this has the mystique of it. I think that comparison at least is similar.
I'm not disagreeing with that. That's for sure.
And we've sat with this for a week. I would need to sit with this further to see really where it stacks up if we're going to compare. Anybody else have anything else to say?
Not really.
Yeah. I still call it an art piece in its own right. On to Wingsuit.
Yeah.
Yep. So the song
Different.
The song starts fairly strong for me. I mean, I really like the first verse. I mean, I really like it instrumentally.
The verses are really fun.
I really enjoy the instrumentation. Isn't this the one that had the piano chord that you really liked, Steve?
It had a piano, a riff that I really liked,
Riff.
which was sort of an extended riff, almost like a melody unto itself, where it went into this whole series for like 5 to 7 seconds or so, and that whole expanse of time, which is actually pretty long for a riff, is I think the driving force to most of these verses.
Yeah, it was the core that really propelled these verses.
Yeah.
And
I'm inclined to think, though, that was one of the most intriguing parts. And there's also this little light hi-hat in the background that is incessant. But, much like Waiting All Night, it does provide that same sense of constancy. The only difference here is that whereas Waiting All Night never really pulled away from anything, this does. It really does. The second it shifts to the choruses, it's I gotta say, it tanks.
Oh,
It doesn't-
yeah.
Pulls the emotional plug once again.
Here's the thing. It's not like we're going, well, the chorus and the verse don't go together. They obviously have similarities in...
Well, that's like the argument I made in the beginning of the album.
There are similarities between the chorus and verse that do make them relatives to one another, that do make them part of the same song. The problem is, the chorus is such a different type of song.
It goes back to that
Emotionally,
pop
it's
structure, if I'm not
yeah.
mistaken.
But it's a sudden change, too. It's almost like there's almost no transition between the verse and the chorus. It's just...
But it's not like there's a break. I'm not feeling a break between the verse and chorus where I'm going, that was bad, you shouldn't have done that. It's like, I'm more disappointed in what they did, not how they did it here.
Yeah. Well, and also it's just this fact that they have this sweeping beauty in the verses, and then they don't try and even do anything like that for the chorus. The chorus just, it's not necessarily divorced, it fits within the song's flow, it just feels so emotionally disconnected from the verses.
Yes. Except, there is another example of them doing the same exact thing later on. And that's with the
There was
outro.
an example of them doing earlier on. Like
No,
I said,
I mean
I
specifically
made that
this song.
observation in either the second or third track. I think.
No, specifically this song.
Okay.
There is that outro segment, because honestly, let's be frank on this one. The lyrics and the vocals weren't too impressive. They just fit what the music was doing. Here, the outro has a part where it goes from the verse structure to this really awesome outro, but there's no transition.
None. It's not like there's no, the transition is poor, and it's a poor transition. It's as if you cut, copy, pasted where the transition would be and plucked it out, and it just literally went from verse to ending like something was missing. It felt like there was a gaping hole in the track. Like someone had just cut out a section of the reel.
I looked at it this way, and this is the first time I saw this metaphor, because there's this joke of two mathematicians talking with one another, and they're coming up with this proof. And on the left side of the proof is this super complicated formula. On the right side is this super complicated answer. And in the middle, all they write is, and then something magical happens. And that's what happened here. Something magical happens, and they do this amazing outro. It's awesome. It really does bring the whole song together. But there's nothing for it to glue to, because there's no build-up. There's no expose. There's no context for this great combination piece at the end. Why? Where was their frame of mind? Where's their thought process to this point? They're a jam band that has tried to show how they're getting from A to B to C. They skip the alphabet here. There's nothing. What's the context?
I'm in kind of agree. I mean, you're right. That last segment really did imply that there had been so much going on that brought us to this final moment here together, where we get to talk about everything that we've done and put the period at the end of this long and beautiful sentence. And it's just, I don't remember what half that sentence said.
We got to the period without the last three words.
Pretty much, and the last three words were presumably the
other metaphors,
the clincher.
Like
I'm not gonna.
We skip to the last chapter, or we fast forward to the ending.
It's like reading.
It's a spoiler. That's what it ended up being, a spoiler. But there was no
access.
It reminds me of something that I'd like to bring up. We all remember Interpol that I brought on the podcast back in episode 6.
Yep, I remember it like yesterday.
Do you?
I'm gonna say yes.
That's sarcasm for the audience. But I'm not talking about that album. This is a completely separate thing. That was Interpol's self-titled album, Interpol. They had a previous album from 2007 called Our Love to Admire, which was an interesting inverse, where I felt some of the earlier tracks on that album were a little bit lackluster, and then it gradually started to build and build and build, so that tracks 9, 10, 11 were progressively more epic, and I don't use that term lightly. By the time we had the final outro, which began almost in the same exact way as this did, with the cutout, right? And then transition into this sort of thrash. I don't mean that in like the metal sense, but we repeat a phrase, and we repeat it like it is the anthem to our lives, you know, with that level of confidence. To me, was expertly done in that album, Our Love to Admire, 2007. Check it out if you're interested, because it is all about context. Had that last segment just existed with, say, the earlier tracks on that album, just preceding it, it wouldn't have worked. Wouldn't have worked at all. And that's kind of what I see here. I see something pretty lackluster leading up to this seemingly apparent epic outro. So I'm not suggesting that it's really trying to tie together anything. I'm suggesting that this album so far is a hodgepodge of good ideas. I don't really see unity in this. I really would have to strain. But, to be fair, it's part of what I think you do expect from a lot of jam band atmospheres. I'm going to use this as a segue into my wrap-up here, because I think we've pretty much, unless you have some final words before we actually wrap up.
Nope, go for it.
All right. This is going to bleed into today's discussion, which will be about improvisation in general, and jam bands will obviously be a big part of that, because they live and breathe off improvisation. Phish is they live and breathe off improvisation, and that's the way most of the people I know Phish treat them. And I'm going to avoid making any sweeping statements about this band, because even though I really was not a Phish fan, not because I Not because, I'd listened and disliked and then set it aside. It was really more just because they'd never really come across me. I never really had given myself time to immerse myself into their vast discography. But I did, for the sake of this project. As we have a week to listen to the album, we also get to research the band, and just, if it's someone we're unfamiliar with, we get to research what they've done. I went back, I listened to earlier Phish stuff, and it was great. I think the stuff that they came out really early in their career, around like 1990, even, pretty much all throughout the 90s, I listened to, I forget the name of the album, but I listened to an album from 90, from 96. They were phenomenal. They were pulling from all of the best ideas, and in some sense, I heard a sound that was distinctly them, that was set apart from any genre in particular. And yet, I did still feel it was improvisational, but it had their studio work, at least, had the tightness of structure that you can only get from studio work. In other words, the division was solid. They had their live work on one hand, they had their studio work on another. Here, as I said early in this review, and then I brought it up in the middle of the review, there's an issue of not really seeing that divide at all. This could have been a live album, and if it was a live album, it would have been a bland live album. But at least I would have had some justification, perhaps, for some of these shifts. Not to say that live work doesn't work off an existing structure. Usually they do, but there's always that room for failure that you're willing to give a little bit of leeway toward, because there's the experience that you have maybe 3/4 or 4/5 of the way through a concert where you're just not paying as active attention as you perhaps were in the awe of the first few minutes. At that point, you're maybe on a few drinks, you're talking with your friends, you're already kind of familiar with the setting and the framework of the band, that you're not going to judge them on minutia. You did not get to get away with that on a live album. That's why this suffers at times. It has great ideas and it has great segments, but I can come up with very few tracks in this album that are solid front to back, except for the most safe and predictable tracks. And those tracks I'm not going to dismiss, because as I brought up, department store track, Barnes & Noble, overhead music, while you're looking through the books, I don't think this stuff is to be dismissed at all. But it does seem very lackluster for what I know Phish can do. I have to give this I gotta give this a 2.5. That's, I think, pretty safe. Even though the ideas individually I've liked better than many tracks that we've rated higher. Many albums that we've rated higher. That just, the unity of this album can't compete.
I mean, for me, what really hurts this record, beyond the fact that I just didn't like it, was there's no theme, there's no arc. It's completely disjointed, and that really hurts it. I mean, at least in the case of, say, something like Bare Naked Ladies, where we all agreed is very much, their new record is very much department store rock, very tired and safe. There was at least a very thin theme of love and loss, and of, living life, and this kind of pop ideal, and that's what a lot of their albums have, this kind of theme of learning and learning lessons and living life. That wasn't even really here. Like, we have this very, 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 very loose theme of being in a car, but there wasn't even really enough to support that I can even allude at it, really, other than mentioning it. I really like Wombat. I enjoyed it. I think within seconds it made me laugh out loud when I was listening to it at work. And I think it was partially because it just caught me off guard. But comparing it to They Might Be Giants, a lot of their songs do the same to me. And I enjoy them because they catch me off guard. But all the other tracks either only have memorable moments, but now they're starting to bleed together. Like, I wasn't sure that piano moment that you liked, Steve, was in the last track, but I didn't say anything. I waited till you brought it up. And we got to the last track and you hadn't said anything, I was like, that's when I said, oh, was it this track? Because there was a lot of bleed over in my memory because there weren't distinct identifiers to the track with what was going on.
You could play the cut and paste game and might not have lost a step.
Yeah, like if I play this album out of order except for Fuego, because Fuego I distinctly remember, but every other track I could probably swap around and I wouldn't know which track is which. Even if you changed the title on some of them, I probably wouldn't know if you changed my MP3 titles.
Yeah, Fuego, despite my gripes with it, was a bold intro, and frankly I think it oversold this album.
Yeah, oh absolutely. This is the first time in a long time I can think where the first track's skill level...
It had the best jam of the album. It had the best sections, or the most unique blend of sections, even though they weren't always tighter. That kind of thing.
I was actually saying, what the F, what are we going to get here, as I was listening to it in the car.
Yeah.
When they go into that third section, I was slamming the steering wheel going, oh, cool, we're going to get something weird.
Yeah, although, interestingly enough, my gripes with it did turn out to be foreshadowing the more apparent gripes that I had a bit later.
But I mean, really, what hurts this album the most is that I didn't connect with anything. Wombat I connected because I enjoyed it. Yeah, and fun is an important emotion to have too. And then White Queen I connected to...
Winter Queen,
rather.
Is that an emotion or a state of being?
White Queen I connected with too. I got the somberness of it, and I felt something there too. But it was just, it wasn't enough. I mean, on this 11-track album, I connected with 2 and only really liked 1. I mean, I didn't hate the other songs. I kind of just nothinged them.
That's a hell of a way to put it.
And that doesn't mean that they were bad or that I hated them. I just didn't really feel much of anything. But again, I can't ignore their talent. I mean, they're talented musicians. They know how to play their instruments. They do some interesting things in moments of some of the songs. But, it's a 2.25 for me. It's a little lower than Steve's, mostly just because it's clear that I just enjoyed a lot less of it than you guys did. But it's not a 2. I'm not putting it on the same level as Green Day because Green Day visibly made me angry and sick to my stomach at moments. I was so annoyed with it.
We were kind of being nice to them when we were doing it back then because we all lowered them at end of years. I wish I gave it a 1 kind of a thing.
I can't. This album would never be in the 1 range, just because. I mean, first of all, as musicians, they're all really good.
Yeah,
they're all really,
that's
really
what
good.
I'm saying.
This is a problem of I'm gonna
implementation of
not
your ideas.
Even so much. It's a problem of we'll go with that. Implementation and also identity.
Yeah, but it's
I detect an identity crisis as these tracks go from one genre to the next, and even struggle within those tracks themselves to find their place.
But I wouldn't even call that outside the realm of Phish. They've always had a lot of rock plus ideas.
No, yeah, they are all
Rock
across
plus
the genre
jazz,
board.
Rock plus blues, rock plus country, plus psychedelic, plus indie, plus alt. That's what they are.
But it seemed they went a lot further with them.
Yes,
is the thing.
That's the biggest issue I had with this album.
This album dips its toes.
The big problem is, instead of trying to do fusion ideas, they kind of just stuck with an idea for a song and went with it, which is not something I was really looking forward to. They've been doing this for 30 years. They know their music. These are not novices. They were very tight where they were tight. They're very cohesive where they were building something. Even the parts that were kind of pop were exemplary pop. They had every idea down to a science almost. The instrumentation is there. The implementing of said instruments was not. The choices were just why, guys? Why? And I know we're going to get a lot of flack from any Phish fans out there. But
to be fair, I even have an issue with what you said. When they have something down to a science, that doesn't strike me as a good thing. I don't think you should have anything down to a science.
Well,
because
no, I
if
mean,
the second you have it down to a science, it's probably not something you should release.
What I'm saying is,
because then it's predictable.
No, that's what I'm saying. They know how to make funky music. They know how to make jazzy music. They know how to make this, that, and the other thing. They know their repertoire. They know how to make music. I think that's what it's suffering from. Because they know music so well, it's like they don't even have any new ideas on this. There's so little unusual, which is Phish.
Too much.
Phish is unusual.
Too much self-awareness.
That's them. That's what they do. It's just why? There's nothing here that really sets it apart from the crowd. There's nothing offensive. It's boring when it gets down to the worst of it. There's a lot of boring parts here because it's not like they've made it before. It's like the genre is being just represented here. The genre of country was Devotion to a Dream. The funk was 555. That's what they were. In the most primal of sense, they became just genre songs, not musical songs, not inspirational or emotional or inspired. It was boring. In that case, I mean, it is hitting Green Day levels for me. But I love Winter Queen and Wombat and most of Wingsuit and most of Waiting All Night. There are parts there where it's like, that's Phish. Once again, they're back. They're making something new. They're integrating things together and coming up with ideas and presenting beautiful thoughts. I just don't know what the hell happened. It's so disappointing. And this is why I have such a love-hate relationship with them. And some of their ideas are amazing. Some of them are just so boring. I don't know what to do with this.
So you find it boring, man?
Parts. It's just so much chaff.
I think he finds it boring.
It's so much chaff around the great ideas that, yeah, it's a straight up... I'm with Matt. It's a 2.25.
All right, fair enough. I'll defend my 2.5 only because I think I did get not so much a direct emotion from this album, or direct emotional sense, but more of a nostalgic emotional sense, just because of the overall feel-good backdrop that it has going for it. It does remind me of little, moments in college when I'd be strolling down my dorm hallways and then someone on the floor would be blasting this from their room. Puts me in a nice place. And I do see the appeal of it, especially in from how Phish fans would use this, which would, often fit cases like driving in a car on a long journey and just kind of set you in a state where you don't have to think too hard about anything else.
That not thinking hard. Turning yourself off. That is the opposite of what I want from Phish. That's the whole thing. That is the opposite of what Phish has done before.
I just want to say that...
I think some people might argue that, but...
Well, but
this is contrary to what I like in music. I like thinking hard. I like actively focusing on my music.
Instead of getting emotions, you're just getting bland. Contentment.
No, I'm getting impressions. Vague impressions.
But in defense of my rating, I'm not really hugely a fan of jam bands. In fact... Truthfully, I really can't stand them. I don't like them. Live, I imagine it's a fun experience, and honestly, if I saw a jam band live, I'd probably get into it, because it'd be a show. But,
I guess we're segueing.
Yes.
In today's discussion on improvisation and, to a greater extent, jam
if I'm
bands.
listening to you on a CD, I don't want you to jam for 15 minutes. I want you to play a damn song. That doesn't mean it has to be short, but meandering nature in a lot of jam bands and improvisation... or what is posed as improvisation on a studio album is irritating to me a lot.
And so I don't have that problem. I just don't have that problem. I'm going to go out right and say, I love just having fun with music sometimes. You need that kind of catharsis of, let's just do something epic.
Well, let me spotlight Matt for a minute, though, because being the gentleman that you are, you withhold this for the duration of the album, and now going in, you say you're not big on jam bands, which of course is contrary to everything that Phish stands for, since they've been hailed as probably one of the most innovative jam bands of the last 2 decades. So, you basically take issue with that entire premise, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, and I get what you're saying, John, about you like to have fun with your music, but I'm not playing, so jamming's not fun to me. If I knew how to play music and I was jamming in a band and playing in a jam band, that'd probably be a blast.
And now here's the thing, because I do often find that people I know who like jam bands do tend to be musicians themselves. Just a coincidence, perhaps.
But some of our greatest, and I will make this statement, some of our greatest musicians have been those oriented towards just jamming out, just being, inventive in the moment.
And you know why? Because jamming is, sort of exploring your instrument in a real-time atmosphere is one of the best ways to improve at it. You do that for long enough. You have enough sessions where you just get together and say, "All right, well, guys, we're gonna play for the next half hour, right? Not gonna stop. Just keep going." Then you all of a sudden have obtained so many skills. You've obtained skills like, for instance, stage skills, where a good showman would never stop in the middle of performance and be like, I screwed up. I'm sorry. Can we start over? Nope. If you just are in a jam session and you keep going, and that's what you're familiar with, then you're not going to stop. You're going to find ways around every little tonal issue that you have with your instrument, such as, what do I do here? What do I do with this chord? What do I do with this scale? I forgot an idea. I forgot an idea. You're going to come up with ways to work around that, and new ideas will be coming up faster than time would ever have you dispose of.
One of my favorite, like, really, if you have to press me, I would pick this on the album I go to the end of time with, Foxy Lady. I love Foxy Lady.
Help me out. By?
Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, not even familiar.
Dun, 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 Foxy.
That was under 5 seconds. Nice.
Yeah. And when you start talking about an individual like Hendrix or Santana or Grateful Dead, these are musicians that... Can you really say that Hendrix, as a jam band man, and every one of his albums was about that? All Along the Watchtower. That song is just so iconic, and every time I hear it, I love it.
And I love all of Jimi Hendrix, because he's not like those other jam bands. In a lot of his big hits, especially, there's a bigger through line than Grateful Dead or Phish or a lot of other bands. Same with Foxy Lady, the one that you cited. There's actually not a lot of jamming in that song at all. His soloing, maybe. But beyond that, I just don't put Jimi Hendrix in the same category.
I do often find that whenever people mention, oh yeah, I like jam bands, they often, refer to a particular track that is more built around composition and structure than the majority of their work. Because, every jam band has to have that one anthem. They have to have that one track that they wrote, that one song that just seems to supersede all of their other jams, and it obtains this instant cult status. And that's the one that's going to find its way into mainstream media because it's the most accessible. It's the one that isn't hiding behind all of these ambling solos that struggle to find their place and may in moments... They may not in others.
And the other thing was, well, while that's true, Jimi Hendrix, a lot of his studio recordings were not jammy. His live recordings were very jammy.
And those are the ones I actually will listen to more often. Just some of his...
but that's not what I'm saying.
But
Woodstock. You're ignoring what I'm saying. I'm saying my problem is jam bands who sound jammy on their studio work. I have no patience for that. Live jammy stuff I don't mind, because it's a different atmosphere, it's a different environment, and a lot of those songs are integrated together in a way when you're played in a live concert that they mingle well when you jam. But it's bands like Phish, Dave Matthews Band, Grateful Dead, on their studio recordings, every now and then they have a jammy part that goes on too long that drives me bonkers. And that's my issue, is being jammy and improvisational on a studio recording.
Well, but often jazz is built around that.
I have a question then.
Jazz.
Wait. Before you go on, because I know jazz is going to be a big thing about it, and
very important.
But Do you listen to live albums? That's the question I
Yeah,
got.
all the time.
Do you listen to these jam bands live?
Dave Matthews I have. Phish I didn't really listen to that much.
You don't... But I'm talking like old school, like Grateful Dead, because we keep bringing them up. They are a band
absolutely.
that always
The only
got live.
versions of their songs I have are live versions.
But that is, like a studio recording, never going to change. How is that different? Even though it is a recording of a live session as opposed to a studio session, how is that different? They did it one way this way, they did it another way that way.
You get a sense of the energy from the live track. You get a sense of the crowd from the live track, which breaks up some of the craziness, because after the big solo, or in the middle of the big solo, there's a big burst of emotion, and then it comes back around. They've also structured the songs a little bit different on a lot of those live tracks.
But if the crowd wasn't there cheering, would that completely detract from it? If they had done that live version as their studio version, would you be more accepting of it?
Probably not. I think it's mostly I just don't like jam bands, and even though I like the live tracks better, I don't really love
Full circle.
jam bands.
And that's
Full circle, but we're trying to break you from that full circle here.
That's where I love, and where Steve was about to go into before I rudely interrupted him. I do enjoy jazz, though I'll never learn names or names of pieces, names of artists, names of composers. That's something I just don't have the mind to do.
I'll
because
throw you out some
I love
names.
jazz. I'll say it this way: I love
Art
jazz
Tatum,
once.
Dizzy Gillespie, John Coltrane. These, to me, are some of the greatest improvisers to ever live.
But here's how I like jazz, and I know you're probably going to hate me for this. I like jazz once. I haven't been able to go back to jazz songs, and this is where I'm kind of agreeing with Matt, but still vehemently disagreeing on some aspects. I like the idea of the free form that jazz just always has promoted to me ideologically. It's just the idea of jazz equates freedom. As much as rock and roll was the idea of peace, love, and happiness and changing the world, jazz has always been just a musical interpretation of true liberty and breaking the system and being different but completely unique at all the time. For that reason, I can't listen to the same jazz track too many times before it just becomes tired to me.
Okay, devil's advocate.
The
Why?
funny thing, well, I'm gonna just interject there to say that mostly when I encounter jazz, it's hard for me to become so familiar with a jazz track that I know it intimately, because the solos are often so long and so expansive that it's tough for me to just know it enough that one listen will really be it. In fact, the only reason I may be so sparing with jazz is because it's almost daunting to listen to a jazz album. It's a heavy, engrossing task, which demands all of my experience with music theory and I suppose form direction. Perhaps that's not how everyone listens to jazz, but some people just sit there and they just groove to it, and I can groove to it too. But it's still, every moment is so intricate, and every moment goes to something a drastically new place. That to me is the only reason why it's not a one-time thing for me, but it's more like a once-a-year thing for me, because then I go back to it and it draws me in. But perhaps as a growing musician, I will get over that. I've always expected to get over that, which I have with certain jazz artists, not all. But that's just interesting how we seem to come at that from opposite fronts.
Well, I mean, I'll say that I like jazz. I definitely like it. I just don't really access it a lot. I mean, maybe if I looked for it more, I would enjoy it.
Inspiration. You have to have someone give you that jazz album.
Well, I've never heard jazz and been like, oh, this is terrible. Like, I always enjoy it when I hear it. I just never really go out of my way to hear it. But my question is, John, if you can only listen to jazz once because it does whatever it does to you and you don't want to hear it again, how is that different from the jam bands?
The way I look at it is that jazz is a different beast. Besides just the idea of freedom, it's chaos. I think that's where I get the idea of freedom for. Jazz, always seems to be upon the cusp of true chaos, and I don't want to try to define that. I don't want to find order in it outside of just incidental as I'm listening to it. I want to feel that random nature to it.
Well, I'm about to step in here and define a big separator between jazz and disclaimer here. Our current perception, perhaps a negative perception of what a jam band really is, because obviously a great jam band, I believe, could overcome this and be more similar to jazz in this regard. Because there's bad jazz too. Point is, jazz usually revolves around bracketing the solo work or the comp work as something that is so intricately tied to the primary A section or the primary refrain that gets returned to as needed, sometimes with upwards of 5-6 minutes in the middle where you don't even revisit that structure, and yet it finds its way to go on this long journey, steady but surely, without teleporting anywhere, without doing anything that is unlike where you'd expect the journey to travel. And it goes far away sometimes, and at some point it reels its way back, and you understand contextually, sometimes after the fact, how it all fit together. This is probably the greatest thing about jazz. Jam bands can do this too, although we don't often encounter it, and perhaps today was a very poor example of it. Where jam bands often, I think you're more in someone's mind. You're less on a journey where it's one step in front of the other, even though you may take odd turns, but you're in someone's mind where you don't always have to be linear. Sometimes your mind, we can all be very scatterbrained. We can think about all the things we want to do today, right? Even if we want to focus on one thing, we just don't always do it. We might be on one task, and then all of a sudden, we're jumping to a completely different task. That's just the way the human brain works, unless you really will yourself into it, right? Which we do all have the power to do, as can jam bands. But I don't think they always want to. I think a lot of times the fun of being in a jam band is that you're kind of interested, especially in a community jam band. One instrumentalist is interested to see what the other instrumentalist would do and where his mind might jump sporadically to, just so that other instrumentalist can shift gears and then follow what that other guy's doing. It's part of the fun. Not to say that jazz doesn't have that fun, but I think it's traditionally sort of gone back to this academic mindset, you know, of being very formal in where those particular key changes will occur, and it's just, you know, one step to the next. You can do so much with that, but it requires so much more focus. That's just a cultural distinction, I think, between the two. But obviously, jam bands can do what I just cited for jazz, and jazz can be as poorly structured as what I just cited for jam bands. So really, they shouldn't be so different. It's just our cultural perception, which I think is where you're coming from, Matt.
It could be. I mean, also, we've reviewed jazz on the podcast, and I liked what we listened to. I mean, Chick Corea did...
Episode 57.
Did really cool stuff. And, like, I mean, that bass solo, I'm still telling people about that bass solo from whatever track that was in, because I can't remember, because I'm not Steve. You know, I really enjoyed Chick Corea a lot. Would I go out and buy his record? Would I go out and see him in concert? Well, actually, I'd probably see Chick Corea in concert, because I feel like that would be an experience. But it'd be less about the music and, oh, I can't wait to hear that track or that solo. It'd be more about, man, I'm going to see Chick Corea. This show is going to be amazing. You know? And I imagine with a lot of these jam bands, it'd be the same for me. If I'm engaged at the live show, because every live show, I always enjoy live shows. But just the immediate personal experience removed is what hurts me for the jam band, and to a lesser extent, jazz too.
That's a whole other area of this discussion, is obviously the live versus studio setting when it comes to improvisation. First of all, improvisation, it's whether it's planned or not, I think, is really the big question. Because on a studio recording, we all expect everything to be put together, you know, meticulously, as we said. We expect there to be this unified product that was worked really, really hard toward, and who knows how many edits or post-edits had to go into making it. But obviously, improvisation is the core of almost any musician's ideas. Otherwise, ideas would never happen. At some point, you have to sit at your instrument and just play. And then, after maybe 5 minutes or so, you've noticed, that was cool. Maybe I should write that down. That's improvisation. Great. But that's not always meant to be done in front of a person.
Yeah, that's my stance.
I've plenty of recorded improvisations that I've done at the piano, and I would never release any of them because they're totally for just getting ideas on the board. That's it. And then I'll pull from them as needed later on and figure out what works where.
And I'll admit, watching...
That's the part that's called writing the novel.
Well, just speaking of what Steve says, I've watched Sarah write, because she's written a few songs down. I watch her, fiddle on the guitar and play some chords and see where she draws inspiration from improvising. And I enjoyed watching it from the standpoint of, I don't know how to write music. This is a cool, interesting thing I'm watching. But I don't know that I would listen to it on a CD, her just fiddling and trying to figure out how to write a song.
There's a big difference the second you decide to professionalize it.
That
takes
where,
balls.
But that's where the greats truly come in. And that's why you say something like Jimi Hendrix's studio work. Yeah, it was a jam at once. And sometimes some of those great pieces that seem to be just perfect studio songs were really just a once and done. We're really that instance where he figured out the song as he went along. Mm-hmm. That guitar riff he did there, that sounds the same every time he does it, that was that idea that he was able to just make. That's why I love jamming music. That's why I love jam bands.
Especially in the very beginning of the podcast when I proposed that thing about how a lot of times people don't, go to live albums and listen actively. Well, you're right. That is total crap, because people do go to live albums and listen actively. And that's funny, because that's almost contrary to what you're saying now. Because when you are listening to that person's product at a show, a lot of times you're listening to huge portions of the song that really were just made up on the spot. And yet, these albums, these live albums, obtain cult status. And they're constantly gone to by every listener of or every fan of the band, and they all seem to agree. Wow, that was amazing. That is inspiration, pure inspiration on the spot, and that's the same thing that what John's talking about. That was made instantaneously, and it was instant perfection.
I mean, we know collectively, all three of us know Baba O'Reilly, by The Who. I remember that song at my first concert ever at 14. The ending became like a 25-minute monstrosity. Because it's Baba O'Reilly. It's Teenage Wasteland. It's the song The Who had that truly brought them to a whole nother level of stardom after they were already there. A 25-minute outro that, honestly, I could not get enough of. I wish I had a recording of it, because it was just a violin guitar riff over that background rhythm that was just epic, pure, utter epic.
That's the thing. Sometimes you're just in a zone. But let's go back to what you started to say before. The hot shots, like the Jimi Hendrixes out there. People like that have lived their entire life off of improvisation, because that's what people pay to see them do. And whether they plan that or not is anyone's guess, but clearly they've worked at it hard enough, and that's what people recognize them as. People who will blow their minds instantaneously. This is the kind of thing that I think we're looking for, and I think this is where this conversation is ultimately going, is should the standards be higher for an improvised recording?
Yes. And I'm not saying that these bands that John mentioned...
But it is a different art form, you'll admit.
Yes, and I'm not saying that John... And see, you know what it is? I think it's more and more I don't like jam bands, but I do like improv. Because I can name an artist right now who's completely based around improv, whose music I love, though I can't name any of his tracks because he doesn't know what they're called. And that's Reggie Watts. I love Reggie Watts. I think he's great and brilliant and fun, and 90% of the live music he performs is improvised on the spot with the looper that he uses. But, I don't know, there's something about it that's different. Maybe it's the element of comedy that he weeds through a lot of his stuff, that keeps me engaged. So even if it's something that doesn't interest me, or maybe it's just my experiences with Phish and whoever else were poor experiences, and I need to reevaluate them, give those songs another try, and see if maybe there is more that I like there.
It's like the whole problem I think I have in arguing this is that I look at a piece like the three-string Star Spangled Banner from Woodstock, and I know it's been a song that's been like people have poured over so many times because it's just Jimi Hendrix riffing the Star Spangled Banner. And honestly, at this point, it's too familiar for me to enjoy it at the same level I did as a child. But at the same time, it's still one of the most amazing, just pure improv pieces I've ever heard. Just from the framework of the idea, well, half of his guitar was broken, and the rest of it was out of tune. And the whole like mystique and mystery and mantra that came around this of just everything that he does with it, and it's still just completely unrecognizable at parts, yet still the Star Spangled Banner. I look at that, I'm like, that is music at its core. That is the presentation of a person's soul through music.
So you really like it, huh?
Well, no, it just became an icon to me because it's him just at the moment just presenting himself through his instrument.
No, I got you. And granted, we could sit here and gush about how many, great improvs that we've grown up to love, or you just grew up with. But I think what I'm really trying to get at here, and I have one little element to cover before we get into this. That's the distinction between simply soloing and jamming, and that's a big difference. Because like what you described with Reggie Watts, that's solo. It's his. No one really controls him. He has total control over that entire process. Now, to some extent, also soloists in a band have total control. They're a little bit beholden to other instrumentalists, but the idea behind a soloist in a band or a soloist in a jazz atmosphere is that they should have the reins while every other instrumentalist takes a back seat and does something kind of inane or mundane. Something that's repetitive, that you don't really have to think too much about, that just really serves to highlight that centermost musician. This is a bit different than jamming, and somewhere in between these two extremes you find comping, where you actually have an instrumentalist who is taking definitely back seat, but also steps in to highlight the other musician through their active work. Less doing repetitive refrains, but constantly following where the soloist moves, and following him every step of the way, and then shaping him context. That to me is even more of a refined art form, is the art of comping. But then when you move into jam atmospheres, there's not really a soloist. There's not really one person. You're dealing with people who have very different minds, although you assume if they're in a jam band that they have some kind of chemistry that has shaped them, that their minds will act cohesively, some respect or another. But how often can you expect that to work? I think this is why there's very few jam bands, going back to what we said again at the very beginning of the podcast. You said there's few that have reached the mainstream. I think that's maybe why. Is because it's such a challenging thing to reach, where all of these separate musicians, who are probably great soloists in their own right, all of a sudden now have to solo together, which is totally an oxymoron, but that's what they have to do.
It's the whole idea, and there's some truth to this, but a jam band doesn't do good studio work. It comes down to, it's hard to present the fluidity and the emotion of jamming.
That's only because that's not what they're popular for.
Yeah.
It's like I said again, people go to these people for their live albums. They go to them for their shows.
And it's because you cannot make a studio album that will hit the level of your live shows, that you just don't get press the same way.
And that wraps me around to what I was getting at before, which is, should they be beholden to a different standard? And you said, with an unblemished yes, Matt, didn't you? Should jam bands, should Yeah, we'll say jam band specifically. Should they be beholden to a different standard? Because when you consider it, the fact that they
standard or higher standard?
No,
You said
different
higher.
standard.
different standard, because we'll decide what that is in a minute. This is where we're going to put this to the panel right here. But we just said that, it's very challenging for them to do what they do at all. The fact that, 5, 6 different minds, I forget how many, were actually involved in some of the larger jams in a Dave Matthews context, but sometimes many more musicians have to just act cohesively. Some might be taking more backseat than others, but at least you have a multitude of active musicians following the same pattern. Within that, yeah, they might have sub-solos, but all, generally, same time.
I mean, I think
That's phenomenal.
I think if you're gonna do something like Jimi Hendrix did, or like Grateful Dead did, or even Dave Matthews, I think it does take another level of performance art and understanding of music to accomplish it. I think also in the fact with a band like Dave Matthews, they're known for their studio work. They're known for their live jamming, but they're known for their studio work. And I think my blemish with live bands comes from them and like listening to their studio work, which I love. I love a lot of Dave Matthews studio work. Yeah, I said it. But then their live album comes out, and Ants Marching, instead of being 3 minutes, is 8 minutes. I have to sit through a 5-minute guitar solo that I'm not interested in because it's not that great. I think that's where my annoyance with jam bands comes. When you take a studio
But that's
song...
specifically a solo, though.
I think,
a solo within a jam
well,
band.
I think that when a band gets jammy on a single track that was a hit in the way I imagine it, because of the way I liked it, when they change it up, depending on how it goes, maybe I won't like it as much. Not to say it's bad, I just don't enjoy it the same. But bringing it back around to what you said about how they should be held by a different standard, I mean, can you personally judge jazz exactly the same way you judge pop music?
No, I can't.
Can you judge jazz exactly the same way you judge heavy metal?
Those are more similar, only in some ways, but obviously they're different. And we every week when we encounter a different genre, we usually rate it on a whole plethora of factors that often include the genre that they chose and how well they do that. But then we do take it the next level and say, well, what does what they chose do for us?
And then also consider the genre of jam band, if that's a genre. But that doesn't say anything to the music type. Technically, you could have a pop jam band. In fact, I'm pretty confident that to say that when they were still together, Mumford & Sons definitely jammed on stage. I have no doubt in my mind.
Yes.
Here's the
Their
thing,
live
though.
stuff was
Most bands jam on stage. We expect this of almost every band when we go see a concert because that's the extra something that you're getting, that you're paying for, that you couldn't get on the studio release. So you go to a concert, you get your favorites, you get the songs, you get the singles, and then you get some interesting stuff, and then you get the stuff that you wouldn't find anywhere else, that is straight from the rehearsal room.
So then I think the real question is not
what
whether
constitutes a jam band?
There you go. I don't think it's whether we should judge them at a different standard, but what makes them a jam band. Like, if you ask anybody, the Grateful Dead are a jam band.
Because they're improvisational. Because that's who they are at their core.
I think it's at that point it's a matter of sheer quantity. It's a matter when you're talking about Grateful Dead, almost every track will have room for a solo, and it's gonna be a long one. So be ready. Every track is built around that freedom that you're gonna have.
The only way to really tell a jam band is just, are they better live? That might be the real criteria in the
joke.
long haul.
That's the joke, although that might end up being the accidental truth.
Yeah, are they better live? Well, then they probably lean more towards jamming sessions as opposed to pure composition. Because
studio work is a surefire way to depart that and to confuse the otherwise perfected process of a jam band. No, I'm just hearing me out though. Is that once you think about something in studio terms, then you need to invoke other talents that you wouldn't have to invoke. No matter how many years that you've been jamming and you've refined that art, the second you have to start mixing and matching and placing things, your instinct, to be frank, is more just, it's good that first time. If your first instinct is the best one, then that's what you're more inclined to go with. But on a studio release, that's very rare that you can achieve that, because you're going to have people cross-checking you.
You're not going to just try to sound great tonight. You're going to have to sound great for the rest of time with this piece you're producing.
Yeah, but on the same level, well, I guess the idea that if a band's better live than they're a jam band, but I think most talented bands are always better live.
Oh, God, no. I would not agree with that at all.
Okay, what's your example?
My experience
Less
has
Than
been
Jake.
Next.
Me First and the Gimme Gimmes. Bowling for Soup.
So you think they're talented, but they're not better live?
They're not better live.
Okay, but
Suicide Machine was actually really poor comparatively to their CD.
Regardless of just spilling off names.
Honestly, most
is
albums, most bands that I've seen live, were better on the radio.
See, and I just disagree, because I've seen a lot of concerts, and percentage-wise, most of those bands were as good or better live
than in their work, than in their studio work.
Yeah, for me.
Why don't you like jam
I
bands
no,
more?
hold on, no, hold on. I think you're entering more of a philosophical question here, and that's do you like the product, or do you like the process?
Are you asking me, or are you putting that out there to the universe?
Well, always both. Always both.
So, do I like the product or the process better?
Yes. First of all, you are.
I don't know that I could pick one over
as
the
a member,
other.
as a fellow host here, and an avid interviewer. You've interviewed many musicians before. You said before that you enjoy learning about how a musician comes to do what he does.
Sure.
So obviously, one of the best ways you get to learn that is to actually hear him in the process of that inspiration. Just like you said with Sarah in listening to her build the ideas in the guitar. And obviously, and even though it's in a more professional setting, listening to a professional improviser, a professional soloist do that same exact thing is tantamount to the same as that interview.
Yep. But I'm only listening to it a few times. I'm not listening to it over and over again on CD.
Ah, so you don't think that has longevity?
I think I feel the same way about jam bands that John feels about jazz. I'll listen to it a couple of times. I get what I want from it. I feel like it's educational and enjoyable. But I don't know that I want to listen to it over and over again.
I think you finally crossed into where I stand with jam bands. Because I've been kind of on the fringe here playing interviewer for this, but I obviously have an opinion too, and it goes very much in line with that.
You have an opinion too?
Yes, I do.
Really?
I always have opinions.
I thought 1 week we just weren't going to get an opinion out of him.
Let him have his opinion so we can, move on.
I've been very good up till now. I'm just turning it off for the sake of this discussion, which has been pretty interesting so far. But I think that sums up very beautifully what I feel about jazz bands, jam bands, and soloing and improvisation in general. I think it's an educational tool, and there can be those moments, right? Those solos that I can listen to over and over, but they have to be the most refined solos out there. A lot of time, I think my standard really is higher for that atmosphere. If it's going to stand the test of time, it needs to be a solo that was thought out. You can't really treat a solo 100% like a solo, because a lot of times, even the great solos out there in the ether that you may have thought were just shat out, probably weren't. They probably, were built around patterns, and what I mean by patterns is, like interval patterns, such as, alternating, retrograde, inversion, all the stuff, all the building blocks that actually compose every one of the solos that you've come to know and love. These things have been worked out and studied and hammered down by every great soloist, so that by the time they reached that one great solo, the one that you are listening to over and over and over again, they not only incorporated those tools and studied those tools, they also had to build a structure around their song that this solo had to pull from along with the given tools. That is tantamount to brilliance. But how often do you going to find that? Because this creates this little dichotomy where which one is easier or which one is more difficult, meticulous composition or improvisation, just fluid improvisation straight from the mind. Because really, neither are pure. In that case, there's always this crossover between the two.
And I think that kind of speaks to why I find most music live to be just a poor substitute. It's when they're just reproducing that thing that they've created once and have done since then. My favorite concerts, just my favorite musicians to see live, were the ones that really pushed the envelope. Were The Who, where they just started rambling for 25 minutes. Where Dropkick Murphy, because when they do a show, it's just wicked, because they futz with everything. They just screw around with everything. They don't play what you heard on the CD.
Yeah. I think that sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds about right.
That was fun. I didn't realize you hated. I mean, you loved live so much more than
It's not a matter
CD.
of well.
I didn't
throw in
honestly
this.
until we discussed this. I didn't realize I disliked so much live music compared to the CD, or just thought it was as good.
I do have a final thought, but I'll hold
I
it.
connect more emotionally to live music because also if I can see the inflection and the emotion in the singer's face as they're singing those emotional lines, I feel it and then I connect. I mean, if someone's singing a hyper depressing song and they're crying while they're singing on stage, you can bet your ass I might be too. It's one of those things that I connect on another level when I can experience the music with the person who created it in the moment live.
It goes both ways, because despite what I said, I go with what you said before. It's an educational tool, but that's not always an emotional thing with me. It's interesting to see them in the moment, and a lot of times it is very pure because, well, what's more raw than real time human emotion? At the same time, there's just that split where when I think back to the product, I think a lot of times I'm more intrigued to see what the artists put his soul into, what the artist knew that he wasn't going to achieve once, or what he knew he was going to fail at more times than once.
What he can't get off the cuff.
What he can't get off the cuff. That's something that to me that is I think beyond. You have to know your mind well enough to be that good as an improviser, which is why people often go one direction or the other, and why we see this great divide between the two, is because at some point in our lives we decide who we are. We decide whether the type to work and be in the studio and refine, or work at the process of having a better stream of consciousness. You know, I don't know. It says something about our personalities, but that's pretty much where it lies.
Why don't you take us into the final thoughts?
The final thoughts? Oh, those were the final thoughts.
No, I mean, like your...
Oh.
You don't shut up. You have everything else to say.
Yeah, it's on you.
The rest of the album is... The rest of the episode is still about you.
Is it?
Because it's your choice, and your mail, and everything like that.
What's that? What did you just project on me? I have no idea what you just projected.
John, stop talking. Steve, read us our spam mail, please.
Spam mail of the week. Da-da-da, it's the spam mail, it's the spam mail.
Spam mail. Spam mail.
What a material of unambiguity and preservedness of precious know-how on the topic of unpredicted emotions. By Google AdWords Express.
That is awfully nice of them.
Thank you.
Was it nice? I don't know if they actually said anything.
Google noticed us. Don't move. It's like a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
It can't see us if we don't move.
If we move, it'll eat us.
I love the wording there. We're a material of unambiguity and a preservedness of precious know-how.
Why didn't they just Why did they just make everything negative in that? Un and non and all sorts of things like that.
I think there was one thing like
Their
that.
prefixes
I think there was just one thing like that.
Their prefixes
I really think you're exaggerating this one.
were superfluous.
I think he's trying to make something out of nothing. Steve, what are we doing next week?
Next week, I procrastinated long enough. I'm going to go for something fairly mainstream. They're incredibly mainstream, in fact, not just fairly. Coldplay. I gotta admit it. As much as I'm not the most mainstream guy, I loved Coldplay, especially for what they were around mid 2000s. Came out with an album called Parachutes back in '05. They got Album of the Year. I adored it. I absolutely adored it. And it was the first time I was like, wow, go us. We picked an Album of the Year that is just solidly, I was pleased with that pick. I mean, even though there are probably other great albums that came out that year, and perhaps other albums, pushed music further beyond the boundaries, I think there's something to be said for that even middle ground, for something that is not so safe as to fall under generic pop ica. I don't know, I just threw in a suffix there. But also not something that is so clouded and underground as to exclude half its audience. Coldplay was that perfect middle ground, but I want to see where they are now.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because Coldplay is going to be the first artist we review that Spotify is struggling to get them to agree to release their music, which actually might not be a terrible thing to talk about that day as well.
That's right, and the album is called Ghost Stories.
Ghost Stories.
So listen to it, catch up on it, and listen to us next week.
As always, thank you for listening. Shoot us an email through the site, Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, and other things. You can grab our RSS feed and throw it in your RSS feed app on your Android. If you're not an iTunes folk, we are on iTunes. Give us a review and a star rating. The whole 9 yards.
We got 5 orange buttons on our homepage.
We do.
Click all of them.
Click all of them.
At once.
All at once.
You can't even do it, can you?
No.
I challenge you, though.
Yeah, it's a worthwhile challenge. We're also, I want to apologize, we're struggling to update the YouTube fast enough, but we're getting on that, and we will, in the coming weeks, try and get it all going a little faster.
Good.
That's really it. So thank you for listening, guys, and remember, as always, music is life, and life is good.